Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The smell hit me first. That sharp, metallic tang that crawls up your nostrils and settles behind your eyes like a headache waiting to bloom. I stood in the doorway of what had once been my grandfather's study, paintbrush dripping forgotten in my hand, staring at the corner where the wall met the floor. The floorboards there were darker than the rest, swollen with moisture that had no business existing in a room I'd spent 3 weeks meticulously waterproofing. I'd bought this house 6 months after Grandpa Joe passed, drawn by memories of summer visits and the promise of starting fresh somewhere that felt like home. The study had been last on my renovation list, a cramped, book-lined cave that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. But standing there that October evening, watching shadows lengthen across walls I'd just painted eggshell white, I realized I might have made a mistake leaving it for last. The stain was roughly the size of a dinner plate, its edges irregular and organic, like spilled coffee that had been left to spread and dry. Except it wasn't dry. When I knelt and pressed my palm against the darkened wood, my hand came away damp, the moisture cold and somehow thicker than water should be. The acrid smell intensified, making my eyes water. I spent the next hour pulling up floorboards, expecting to find a burst pipe or evidence of some long-forgotten leak. Instead, I found dry subflooring and solid beams, all of them bone dry despite the October rains that had been hammering the roof for days. The moisture seemed to be coming from nowhere, or everywhere, seeping up through wood that showed no signs of water damage. That night I moved my mattress into the study. The rest of the house still felt too empty, too full of echoes in spaces that remembered voices I'd never hear again. The study, despite its problems, felt safer somehow, contained. I positioned the bed against the far wall, as far from the stain as the cramped space would allow, and tried to convince myself that morning would bring answers. I woke to the sound of my name, not shouted or called, but whispered with the soft persistence of wind through leaves. Marcus. Just that. Spoken so quietly I might have imagined it, might have been caught in that liminal space between sleep and waking where the mind plays tricks. I lay still, listening to the house settle around me, to the tick of the old radiator and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The smell was stronger now, filling the room with that sharp, unpleasant tang that made my stomach twist. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, and when light flooded the study, I saw that the stain had grown. Not dramatically, just a few inches in each direction, spreading like spilled ink across the floorboards. But it was definitely larger, definitely darker, and when I approached it on unsteady legs, I could see that it was still wet, still seeping that thick, cold moisture that had no source and no reason to exist. I spent the next day researching foundation issues, calling contractors, and pricing dehumidifiers. The internet offered a dozen explanations: condensation from temperature changes, seasonal settling, problems with the crawlspace ventilation. All reasonable, all logical, all failing to explain why the moisture felt different against my skin, why it left a residue that soap couldn't quite wash away. The second night, the whisper came earlier. I hadn't even fully settled into sleep when I heard it, my name spoken with that same soft insistence, but closer now, as if the speaker had moved from across the room to just beside my bed. I kept my eyes closed, telling myself it was the house settling, the old pipes expanding and contracting, anything but what it sounded like. But when the whisper came again, I felt breath against my ear, cool and damp and smelling of that same metallic tang that had begun to permeate everything. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and found myself alone in the study. The stain had grown again, spreading toward the center of the room with tendrils that followed the grain of the wood like dark veins. I grabbed a flashlight and examined every inch of the walls and ceiling, looking for cracks, for signs of moisture intrusion, for anything that might explain what was happening. Nothing. The walls were solid, the ceiling unmarked. Only the floor showed signs of the creeping dampness that seemed to emerge from the wood itself. By the third night, I'd had enough. I dragged the mattress to the living room, positioning it near the front windows where streetlight could chase away the shadows that had begun to feel too deep, too knowing. I told myself I was being rational, practical. Why sleep in a room with a moisture problem when I had a whole house at my disposal? But when I woke the next morning, I found a new stain on the living room floor, directly beneath where I'd slept. Smaller than the one in the study, but unmistakably similar. That same dark, wet presence that shouldn't exist. I moved to the guest bedroom that night. The stain followed. Then to the master bedroom. Again, it followed. Each morning brought fresh evidence of the impossible. New patches of dampness that appeared overnight, always beneath where I'd laid my head, always accompanied by that whisper that had begun to sound less like wind and more like a voice. Urgent and hungry, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. I stopped sleeping altogether. For 3 days, I paced the house in a haze of caffeine and desperation, researching everything from supernatural manifestations to rare mold species to psychological disorders that might cause hallucinations. I called my doctor, made an appointment I couldn't afford, and submitted myself to a battery of tests that found nothing wrong beyond elevated stress hormones and severe sleep deprivation. The stains continued to spread, not just where I'd attempted to sleep, but throughout the house now, appearing in random locations like an infection spreading through the bones of the building. I found them in the kitchen, creeping up from beneath the sink, in the hallway, spreading across the hardwood like spilled wine. In the bathroom, dark patches that wept moisture onto towels I'd just washed. And always, that smell. Always, the whispers that came not just at night now, but during the day. Soft voices that seemed to emanate from the stains themselves, calling my name with increasing frequency and volume. I hired a contractor. He found nothing wrong with the foundation, nothing wrong with the plumbing, nothing that could explain moisture appearing in locations where no water had any business being. He suggested I call someone about black mold, gave me a number for a remediation specialist, and left shaking his head at problems that made no sense. The remediation specialist found no mold, no bacteria, no fungal growth of any kind. He took samples of the moisture, promised to have them analyzed, and called me 3 days later with results that only deepened the mystery. The liquid wasn't water, not exactly. It contained traces of minerals that had no business existing in this region, organic compounds that didn't match any known substance in his database. Honestly, he said, his voice carrying the bewilderment of a man whose expertise had failed him, I've never seen anything like it. It's like it's not quite from here, if that makes any sense. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. But I was beginning to suspect that sense had nothing to do with what was happening in my grandfather's house. On the 7th night, or what would have been the 7th night if I'd still been sleeping, I found myself back in the study, staring at the original stain that had now consumed nearly half the floor. The smell was overwhelming here, thick enough to taste, metallic and organic and wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The whispers had become a constant murmur, dozens of voices overlapping in a chorus that spoke my name with the persistence of prayer. I knelt beside the largest patch of dampness and pressed my palm against it, feeling that cold, thick moisture seep between my fingers. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and for a moment I could almost make out words beneath the repetition of my name, fragments of meaning that slipped away like half-remembered dreams. "What do you want?" I asked the darkness, feeling foolish and desperate and beyond caring about either. The whispers stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, harsh and rapid in the oppressive air. Then slowly, a single voice emerged from the quiet, clearer than the whispers, more substantial, carrying weight and purpose that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "Sleep," it said. Just that one word, spoken with the hunger of something that had been waiting far too long to feed. I understood then, with the clarity that comes from crossing the line between rational thought and pure instinct. Whatever was in the house, whatever was spreading through the floors and walls with each passing night, it needed something from me. Not my death, not my pain, but something more intimate, The vulnerability of unconsciousness, the defenseless state of sleep where barriers between self and other grew thin. It had been patient, following me from room to room, waiting for exhaustion to overcome fear. But patience had limits, and I could feel those limits fraying in the air around me, in the way the stains seemed to pulse with their own dark rhythm. I ran, not just from the study, but from the house itself, grabbing keys and wallet and nothing else, fleeing into the October night like a man pursued by demons. I drove until I found a motel on the highway, paid cash for a room, and collapsed onto institutional bedding that smelled of bleach and other people's dreams. But when I woke 8 hours later, refreshed for the first time in a week, I found a small dark stain on the carpet beside the bed, still damp, still carrying that familiar metallic tang, still whispering my name in the morning light. I sit in my car now, in the parking lot of a rest stop 200 miles from anywhere that matters, watching the sun set through windshield glass that reflects a face I barely recognize. Hollow-eyed, stubbled, twitching at sounds that might or might not be whispers carried on the evening breeze. The passenger seat is damp. I haven't slept in 36 hours, but exhaustion pulls at me with gravity. I can't fight much longer. My eyes burn, my hands shake, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I can hear that patient voice reminding me of what it wants, what it's always wanted. Sleep. Just sleep. And maybe in the morning, I'll understand that some hungers are older than houses, deeper than foundations, and persistent enough to follow a man to the ends of the earth if that's what it takes to feed. The dampness is spreading across the upholstery now, seeping into fabric with that same impossible persistence, and I know, with the certainty of a man who has run out of places to run, that distance means nothing to whatever has made me its chosen host. The whispers are getting louder. I close my eyes, just for a moment, and feel the darkness lean in close, patient and hungry, and finally ready to collect what it's owed. Story 2. The rusted hinges of the barn door screamed as we forced it open, releasing decades of trapped air thick with motor oil and decay. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that slanted through gaps in the weathered siding, illuminating a graveyard of forgotten automobiles. Marcus had promised us treasure, vintage parts for the restoration projects that consumed our weekends, but standing in that doorway, I felt only the weight of something watching from the shadows between the hulking metal carcasses. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. "Uncle Jerry's collection. Been sitting here since he passed 15 years ago." The barn stretched further back than I'd expected, row upon row of vehicles in various states of decay. Some were stripped down to their frames, others sat complete but abandoned, their chrome dulled and paint faded to ghosts of former colors. The air carried an odd mixture of scents, rust, leather, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and wrong. Danny whistled low beside me, already moving toward a powder blue pickup that might have been beautiful once. But my attention was drawn to the far corner, where a dark sedan sat apart from the others, draped in a canvas tarp that had slipped halfway off, revealing a sleek profile that seemed somehow more complete than the rest. More present. "You guys start looking around," I told them, not wanting to admit the strange pull I felt toward that distant car. "I'll check out the back section." My footsteps echoed hollow on the concrete floor as I made my way between the rows. The sedan grew larger as I approached, and I could see it was a late 50s model, maybe a Buick or Chrysler. Black paint that had somehow retained more of its luster than it should have, given the environment. The tarp had fallen completely away from the rear, pooling on the ground like shedskin. The trunk was slightly ajar. I paused a few feet away, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. Marcus and Danny's voices seemed distant now, muffled by the maze of metal around us. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. Even the sounds from outside, birds, wind, the distant hum of traffic on the county road, had faded to nothing. The trunk lid was open maybe 6 inches, just enough to create a slice of impenetrable darkness within. No, not quite impenetrable. As my eyes adjusted, I thought I could see something gleaming in there. Chrome, maybe, or glass. I reached for the lid, then hesitated. The rational part of my mind cataloged the sensible explanations. The trunk latch was broken. The contents had shifted over time. The gleam was just a reflection of the overhead light filtering through the barn's gaps. But beneath that rational voice was something else, a whisper of unease that made my skin crawl. The metal of the trunk lid was warm under my palm. Not sun warm. We were deep in the barn's interior, well away from any direct sunlight. Body warm, like something living had been touching it. I lifted the lid. 2 flashlights lay inside, their chrome bodies reflecting the dim light. Both were on, casting weak but steady beams upward. The batteries should have been dead decades ago, corroded to uselessness in the humid barn air. But the light was clean and white and impossible. "Marcus," I called, not taking my eyes off the flashlights. "Danny, you need to see this." No answer. The barn had fallen into the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, but nothing else. I reached for one of the flashlights, then pulled my hand back. The metal would be warm, I knew. Warm like the trunk lid. Warm like something that had been held recently, carried with purpose and intent. A sound broke the silence. A low rumble from somewhere behind me. I spun around, the dark sedan now at my back, and peered through the maze of vehicles. The sound came again, closer. An engine turning over, trying to catch. The distinctive cough and sputter of a motor that hadn't run in years but was somehow trying to remember how. "Marcus!" I called louder this time. "Danny!" The engine noise stopped. In the sudden quiet, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving between the cars. But they weren't coming toward me. They were circling, keeping their distance, maintaining the barrier of metal and shadow between us. I turned back to the sedan. The trunk was still open, the flashlight still glowing their impossible light. One of them had rolled slightly, its beam now pointing toward the back of the car. In that circle of illumination, I could see that the rear window was clear. No accumulated dust or grime like the other vehicles. Clean enough to see through. Clean enough for something to see out. The footsteps had stopped. The barn felt hollow around me, as if the other cars had somehow moved farther away, leaving me isolated with the sedan. I couldn't hear Marcus or Danny anymore. Couldn't hear anything but my own ragged breathing and the soft electrical hum of the flashlights that shouldn't be working. I slammed the trunk shut. The sound echoed through the barn like a gunshot, and in the aftermath, I heard the engine again. Not behind me this time, ahead. Somewhere near the front of the barn where we'd entered. The same coughing, sputtering attempt at ignition, but stronger now, more insistent. I started moving toward the sound, weaving between the dead cars with growing urgency. The afternoon light from the open door seemed dimmer now, farther away. The barn stretched longer than it had when we'd first entered, the rows of vehicles extending beyond what should have been possible given the building's exterior dimensions. "Marcus, Danny!" The names echoed back to me, distorted and strange. I emerged from between 2 pickup trucks and saw the front section of the barn. It was empty. The cars that had been there when we'd arrived, including the powder blue pickup Danny had been examining, were gone. Only oil stains on the concrete marked where they'd been. Dark shapes like shadows burned into the floor. The barn door stood open, but beyond it I could see only darkness. Not the fading afternoon light we'd entered by, but complete, impenetrable black. As if the world outside had simply stopped existing. Behind me, an engine roared to life. I turned to see headlights blazing through the maze of cars, casting wild shadows that danced and writhed between the vehicles. The light was moving, weaving through the rows, getting closer. I could hear the rumble of the engine, the crunch of tires on the concrete floor scattered with debris. I ran toward the door, toward that impossible darkness. But before I could reach it, headlights swept across the opening. The sedan rolled into view from my left, moving slowly, deliberately. Its engine purred with smooth confidence now, No trace of the earlier struggling. The car was pristine, its black paint reflecting the overhead lights like still water. The trunk was open again. The sedan stopped between me and the door, idling with mechanical patience. Through the clear rear window, I could see the interior was immaculate. White leather seats that looked freshly cleaned, chrome that gleamed like it had just been polished. The dashboard lights were on, bathing everything in a soft green glow. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out details. The figure was just a silhouette against the instrument lights, but I could see the outline of a head, shoulders, hands on the steering wheel, waiting. The trunk lid bobbed slightly in the engine's vibration, still revealing that slice of darkness within. The flashlights were gone, but something else was in there now. Something that gleamed with a different kind of light, organic and wet. I backed away from the car, but my heel hit something solid. Another bumper. I turned to find a rust-eaten station wagon that definitely hadn't been there moments before. All around me, the cars were closer now, forming a tight circle with the sedan at its center. Their dead headlights stared like empty eye sockets, their grills twisted into expressions of hunger or pain. The sedan's engine revved once, a polite clearing of the throat. The trunk lid lifted higher, revealing more of that gleaming interior. Not an invitation, a command. I found myself walking toward it despite every instinct screaming at me to run. My feet moved without conscious direction, carrying me past the other vehicles toward the open trunk. The headlights dimmed as I approached, as if the car were closing its eyes in satisfaction. The chrome bumper was warm under my hands as I leaned forward to look inside. The trunk was larger than it should have been, stretching back into depths that couldn't physically exist within the car's dimensions. And there, in the distant darkness, I could see lights moving. Familiar lights. Flashlights. Marcus's voice drifted up from the impossible depths, tinny and distant. "Hey, you guys need to see this. There's more cars down here. Lots more." Danny's voice joined his. "How deep does this thing go? I can't see the bottom." They were down there. Somehow they were inside the trunk, exploring whatever space existed beyond the car's physical boundaries. Their lights bobbed and weaved in the darkness, growing smaller as they moved deeper into that other place. "Marcus," I called down. "Danny, come back up." But my voice seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, swallowed without echo. The lights continued their descent, and now I could see there were more than just two. Dozens of lights moving in the black depths. Other flashlights, other explorers who had found their way into the sedan's secret heart. The car's engine settled into a lower idle, almost a purr. Patient. It had all the time in the world. I could climb in, lower myself into that impossible space and follow my friends. Find out what they'd discovered down there in the dark. The trunk was certainly large enough, much larger than it appeared from the outside. Large enough for all of us. But something made me step back instead. Some survival instinct stronger than curiosity. The sedan's headlights flickered once, disappointed. I turned and ran toward the barn door, but the opening was gone. Solid wall where the entrance should have been, as if it had never existed. The barn stretched endlessly in all directions, filled with cars that hummed and murmured with mechanical life. Some had their trunks open too, revealing their own depths, their own collections of distant lights. Behind me, the sedan's engine revved again, waiting. I walked back to it slowly, each step feeling inevitable. The trunk yawned open like a mouth, and I could still see the lights moving in its depths. Marcus and Danny, still exploring, still descending, still calling to each other about the wonders they were finding down there in the dark. The chrome edge of the trunk was smooth under my palms as I hoisted myself up. The metal was warm, body warm, like something alive and welcoming. I swung my legs over the edge and looked down into the darkness. The descent looked easy, natural, like coming home. But as I hung there on the edge between the world I knew and whatever lay below, a new thought occurred to me. A simple question that cut through the mechanical purring and the distant voices and the patient hunger of the waiting car. How long had it been since Marcus mentioned his uncle's barn? How long since we'd planned this trip? I couldn't remember. The memory felt distant, muffled, like something that had happened to someone else, like something I'd dreamed and confused for reality. The lights in the trunk's depths pulsed gently, hypnotically, calling me home to a place I'd never been but somehow knew. The sedan's engine whispered promises in a language I almost understood, and in that moment between falling and climbing back out, between accepting and rejecting the invitation, I realized I'd been here before, many times, standing at this same trunk, facing this same choice, with the same friends calling from the same impossible depths. The sedan waited for my decision with mechanical patience, and I understood that it would wait forever if necessary. Time worked differently here in the space between invitation and acceptance. It would wait until I was ready to remember why I kept coming back, kept finding my way to this barn that might not exist, to make the choice I'd been avoiding for longer than I cared to count. The voices from below grew fainter, more distant. The lights bobbed and weaved like fireflies in the dark, and I hung there on the edge of everything, unable to move forward or back, while the sedan purred its gentle welcome and the barn full of impossible cars hummed their eternal song of patience and hunger and coming home. Story 3. The hammer slipped from my sweat-slicked palm for the third time that morning, clattering down the steep pitch of my grandparents' roof before catching in the gutter with a metallic shriek. I cursed under my breath, wiping my hands on my jeans before carefully retrieving it. The October sun beat down mercilessly, unseasonably warm for upstate New York. But something else entirely made my skin crawl with unease. The house had been empty for 6 months now, ever since Grandpa's stroke landed him in assisted living, and Grandma followed reluctantly behind. What should have been a simple weekend of roof repairs had stretched into its second week, plagued by delays I couldn't quite explain. Tools went missing. Materials arrived damaged. The weather turned unpredictable, forcing me inside just as I'd find my rhythm. But it wasn't the delays that bothered me most. It was the waiting. I positioned the shingle carefully, lining up the edges with obsessive precision. The repetitive work usually calmed my mind, but today every fiber of my being felt stretched taut, like a guitar string wound too tight. My ears strained for sounds that shouldn't exist in an empty house. My peripheral vision caught movements that weren't there when I turned to look. Thunk. The sound came from directly beneath me, somewhere in the attic space below. Heavy, deliberate, like a boot settling onto old floorboards. I froze, hammer raised mid-swing. The noise echoed in the confined space between the roof and the ceiling, seeming to linger longer than physics should allow. My rational mind immediately began cataloging explanations, settling timbers, thermal expansion, maybe a squirrel that had found its way inside, but my body knew better. Every primitive instinct screamed that something was wrong. Another step, then another. The footsteps moved with purpose across the length of the attic, from the far end where Grandma's sewing room had been, toward the center of the house. They were too heavy for a squirrel, too rhythmic for settling wood. They sounded distinctly human, yet the house below me was empty. I'd checked every room before climbing onto the roof, testing doors and windows, confirming the security system was armed. My breathing became shallow as I lowered myself flat against the shingles, pressing my ear to the roof. The footsteps continued, each one sending a faint vibration through the wooden frame. They moved in a straight line, unhurried, as if whatever was up there knew exactly where it was going. The steps stopped directly below me. I held my breath, counting heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. Just as I began to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, the footsteps resumed, now moving in a slow circle. Around and around, like a predator pacing its cage. My phone felt slippery in my shaking hands as I pulled it from my pocket. If something was really in that attic, I needed proof. I needed evidence that I wasn't losing my mind. The video app opened with agonizing slowness, and I held the device toward the roof, hitting record just as... crack. The sound was wooden, sharp, like a tree branch snapping under too much weight. But it came from beneath me, from the attic floor. I watched in horrified fascination as a section of shingles just 3 feet to my left sank almost imperceptibly, as if something heavy had suddenly pressed down from below. The depression was small, maybe 6 inches across, but unmistakable. The wooden frame beneath groaned softly, adjusting to bear whatever weight had settled there. My phone captured it all: the subtle deformation, the stressed creak of old timber, the impossible presence of something that couldn't be seen. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the depression vanished. The shingles sprang back to their original position with a soft pop, leaving no trace of what had just occurred. The footsteps resumed their patient circling, and I realized with growing horror that they were following me. Every time I moved to a new section of roof, the presence below adjusted its position to match. When I crawled toward the peak, the footsteps tracked me from underneath. When I slid down to work on the lower edge, they followed with that same measured, deliberate pace. I forced myself to continue working, partly out of stubborn determination and partly because I didn't know what else to do. But with every nail I drove, every shingle I placed, my awareness of the thing below intensified. I could feel it watching me through the layers of wood and insulation, matching my movements with unnatural precision. The afternoon wore on, and the heat became oppressive. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes and making my grip uncertain. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the temperature increase wasn't entirely natural. The air above the roof seemed to shimmer with an energy that had nothing to do with the sun. Around 4 o'clock, I decided to test my growing suspicions. I set down my hammer with exaggerated care and called out loudly that I was taking a break, that I'd be back tomorrow. Then I climbed down the ladder, made a show of loading tools into my truck, and drove around the block. I parked 3 houses down and crept back through the neighbor's yard, using the old oak tree to scale the fence into my grandparents' backyard. The house stood silent and still, windows dark, exactly as I'd left it. But as I approached the exterior wall below where I'd been working, I could hear them. The footsteps continued their restless pacing, back and forth across the attic floor. They moved with the same rhythm, the same weight, but now there was something different about them, something urgent, as if whatever was up there was searching for something it had lost. I pressed myself against the foundation wall, straining to listen. The steps paused directly overhead, and I heard what sounded like scratching, long, deliberate scrapes against wood, like fingernails drawn across a chalkboard. The sound sent ice through my veins, and I had to bite down on my knuckle to keep from crying out. The scratching stopped. The footsteps resumed, but now they moved in shorter patterns, more agitated. Back and forth, like something trapped and growing frustrated. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my apartment across town, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day's events. The video on my phone showed everything exactly as I remembered. The depression in the roof, the subtle movements, the impossible weight of something that wasn't there. But watching it back, I noticed details I'd missed in the moment. The shadows were wrong. Even under the direct sunlight, there seemed to be patches of darkness that moved independently of the clouds. And in the audio, beneath the creaking of wood and my own labored breathing, there was something else. A sound almost too low to detect, like whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. I enhanced the audio using every app I could find, isolating frequencies and amplifying background noise. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The whispers weren't random sounds. They were my name, repeated over and over in a voice that sounded uncomfortably familiar. The next morning, I almost didn't go back. I sat in my truck outside the house for nearly an hour, engine running, fighting the urge to drive away and never return. But something compelled me forward. Maybe it was professional pride, or maybe it was the growing certainty that running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was in that attic, it was connected to me now. The moment I climbed onto the roof, the footsteps began again. But this time, they were different, faster, more aggressive. They didn't wait for me to start working before beginning their relentless pacing. It was as if whatever was up there had been waiting all night for my return. I tried to maintain my routine, focusing on the mechanical aspects of the repair work. Measure twice, cut once, keep the rows straight, check for proper overlap. But concentration became impossible as the footsteps grew more erratic. They would stop without warning, leaving me in tense silence, then resume with jarring suddenness. Worse, the depressions in the roof became more frequent and more pronounced. What had started as barely perceptible dips now showed clear indentations, as if something with significant weight was pressing down from below. The wooden frame groaned continuously under the strain, and I began to worry that the ceiling might actually collapse. By noon, I was a wreck. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the hammer, and I'd developed a persistent twitch in my left eye. Every sound, every movement, every shift in the light sent adrenaline coursing through my system. I was operating on pure fight-or-flight instinct, and my body was beginning to break down under the constant stress. That's when I noticed the pattern. The footsteps weren't random. They followed a specific sequence, repeating every few minutes with mathematical precision. 23 steps across the length of the attic, a pause, then 15 steps in the opposite direction, another pause, then a series of short movements, 3 steps, stop, 3 steps, stop, in what seemed to be a grid pattern. I began timing the sequences, marking them down on a piece of scrap paper. The pattern was so regular, it was almost hypnotic. But as I tracked it more carefully, I realized something that made my stomach lurch. The sequences were getting shorter. The pauses between them were shrinking. Whatever was up there was speeding up, like a clock winding toward some predetermined moment. The scratching sounds returned around 2 o'clock, but now they were accompanied by a new noise that I felt as much as heard. A low, thrumming vibration that seemed to emanate from the entire structure of the house. It started as barely perceptible tremor, but gradually increased in intensity until I could feel it in my bones. The vibration had a rhythm, like a massive heartbeat. And as impossible as it seemed, the tempo was syncing with my own pulse. The faster my heart raced with fear, the faster the house seemed to throb around me. It was as if the building itself was alive, responding to my emotional state. I decided to conduct one final test. With my phone recording, I called out to whatever was in the attic. I told it I knew it was there, that I could hear it moving around. I asked what it wanted, why it was following me. The response was immediate and terrifying. Every sound stopped at once. The footsteps, the scratching, the low, thrumming vibration. Everything went dead silent. The sudden absence of noise was more unnerving than all the mysterious sounds combined. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, something began tapping on the attic floor directly beneath me. Tap, tap, tap. 3 measured strikes, followed by a pause. Then 3 more. It was clearly a response, an acknowledgement that something up there had heard me and was answering back. The tapping continued for several minutes, sometimes in groups of 3, sometimes in longer sequences that seemed almost like Morse code. I tried to record as much as possible, but my hands were shaking so violently that most of the footage was unusable. As the afternoon sun began to slant lower, casting long shadows across the roof, the activity in the attic reached a crescendo. The footsteps resumed with frantic energy, pacing back and forth at double speed. The scratching became so intense it sounded like claws tearing through wood. And underneath it all, that low vibration built to a frequency that made my teeth ache. But the most disturbing development was the spreading of those depression marks across the roof. What had started as isolated incidents now covered nearly a quarter of the surface I'd been working on. The shingles dipped and rose like the surface of a turbulent sea, creating a topography that defied explanation. I watched in morbid fascination as new impressions appeared faster than I could count them. It was as if an entire crowd of invisible beings had suddenly materialized in the attic, all of them pressing upward against the ceiling with desperate intensity. That's when the first shingle cracked. It was a small split, barely an inch long, but it appeared right where one of the larger depressions had formed. As I watched, the crack slowly widened, creating a gap that revealed the darkness of the attic space below. No light emerged from the opening, even though the space should have been illuminated by gaps in the older sections of roof. Through that tiny aperture, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Breathing. slow, deep, deliberately controlled breathing, as if something was consciously trying to remain quiet. The rhythm was all wrong for a human. Too slow, too measured, like the respiratory pattern of something much larger. More cracks appeared as additional shingles gave way under invisible pressure. Each new opening released more of that controlled breathing, until it sounded like an entire congregation of hidden watchers drawing breath in perfect unison. The sound was hypnotic and terrifying, and I found myself unconsciously matching my own breathing to their rhythm. As darkness approached, I knew I had to make a decision. The roof was becoming structurally compromised, and my own mental state was deteriorating rapidly. But the thought of leaving felt impossible. Whatever was in that attic had established some kind of connection with me, and I sensed that walking away now would only make things worse. I decided to enter the house. The front door opened easily. I still had the spare key from when I'd helped Grandpa move his things. The interior was exactly as I remembered from my childhood. The floral wallpaper in the hallway, the grandfather clock that hadn't worked in decades, the lingering smell of lavender and old books. But something felt fundamentally different. The air was thick, almost viscous, and sounds seemed muffled despite the emptiness of the rooms. My footsteps on the hardwood floors echoed strangely, as if the house was much larger than its actual dimensions. The access to the attic was through a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. I stood beneath it for a long time, flashlight in hand, listening to the continuing sounds above. The footsteps had slowed to their original measured pace, but they seemed heavier now, more deliberate. And that breathing continued, rhythmic and patient, like something waiting for an invitation. I pulled the ladder down. The attic space was larger than I expected, stretching nearly the full length of the house. My flashlight beam cut through dusty air, illuminating cobwebs and scattered boxes of forgotten belongings. Everything appeared normal, exactly what you'd expect to find in a 70-year-old house. Except for the footprints. They were everywhere, pressed deep into the layer of dust that coated the floor. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, overlapping and crisscrossing in complex patterns. But they weren't quite right. The proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the toe ends. I followed the trail of prints, my flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of me. They led to the center of the attic, where the footsteps had spent most of their time circling. Here, the dust was churned up into deep furrows, as if something had been pacing for hours, days, maybe weeks. In the center of the disturbed area, I found something that made me drop my flashlight in shock. Scratched deep into the wooden floor were letters, carved with patient precision over what must have been considerable time. They spelled out a single word in rough, uneven script. Help. The flashlight rolled away from me, its beam spinning wild shadows across the rafters. In the shifting light, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that seemed to dart between the support beams, always just outside the direct illumination. When I scrambled to retrieve the light and aimed it at where I'd seen the movement, nothing was there. But the breathing had gotten louder. It seemed to come from all around me now, a chorus of invisible lungs drawing air in perfect synchronization. And mixed with it, I heard something new, a sound like fabric rustling, as if large wings were folding and unfolding in the darkness above me. I backed toward the ladder, flashlight sweeping frantically across the attic space. The beam caught more scratched words scattered throughout the area, trapped, forgotten, waiting, lonely, each one carved with the same desperate precision, the same plea for acknowledgement. As I reached the ladder opening, my light fell across one final message, this one larger and more recent than the others. The letters were still pale with fresh wood shavings, as if they'd been carved that very day. Thank you for listening. I fled the attic, pulling the ladder up behind me with shaking hands. But as I descended the stairs, I realized with growing horror that the sounds were following me. The footsteps had left the attic and were now tracking through the house itself, keeping pace with my retreat. I could hear them behind me as I ran through the hallway, down the stairs, and out the front door. They followed me to my truck, to the end of the driveway, and even as I drove away, I could swear I heard them in the distance, growing fainter but never quite disappearing entirely. That was 3 weeks ago. I've since hired a contractor to finish the roof repairs, telling him the job was too much for one person. He completed the work in 2 days without incident, reporting nothing unusual except for some minor structural damage to the attic floor that he attributed to age and moisture. But I still hear them sometimes, late at night in my apartment. Footsteps in the ceiling above me, pacing back and forth with that same patient rhythm. My neighbors have never mentioned any sounds, and my landlord insists the apartment above mine has been vacant for months. I've tried to convince myself it's just echoes, psychological after effects of the stress I experienced at my grandparents' house. But deep down, I know the truth. Whatever was in that attic, whatever lonely presence had been trapped there for God knows how long, it's not trapped anymore. It followed me home. And sometimes when the footsteps pause directly above my bed, I hear that same careful breathing, slow and measured, and infinitely patient. As if something is waiting for me to acknowledge its presence, to finally accept that I'm no longer alone. The worst part is, I'm not entirely sure I want to be alone anymore. There's something almost comforting about knowing that something, somewhere, is listening. Something that carves desperate pleas for help into wooden floors and follows the sound of human activity with such faithful dedication. Last night I found myself scratching a single word into the surface of my nightstand with a screwdriver. Hello. This morning, scratched in the dust beneath my window, I found the reply. Hello, friend. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if what's following me is real or if I've simply lost the ability to distinguish between imagination and reality. But I do know that I'm no longer the only one in my apartment, and that knowledge brings both terror and an inexplicable sense of relief. Because whatever else it might be, at least I'm not alone with my questions anymore. At least something else knows I'm here. Story 4. The brass plaque by the entrance should have been my first warning. The Meridian Hotel, Astoria 1923, renovated 2018. Originally St. Catherine's Military Hospital. But I was tired, running on 3 hours of sleep and enough caffeine to power a small town, so I barely registered the words as I dragged my luggage through the heavy glass doors. The corporate retreat had been mandatory, and somehow I'd drawn the short straw for accommodations. While my colleagues enjoyed the comfort of the Hilton downtown, I found myself assigned to this converted relic on the outskirts, a last-minute booking due to what my assistant called budget constraints. The irony wasn't lost on me, a structural engineer staying in a building that had likely seen more death than most cemeteries. The lobby retained hints of its institutional past. High ceilings with exposed beams painted sterile white, floors of worn terrazzo that echoed with each footstep, and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a sickly pallor. The young clerk behind the desk seemed eager to finish our transaction, her fingers drumming nervously against the keyboard as she processed my information. "Room 247, she said, sliding the keycard across the marble counter without meeting my eyes. "Elevator's just around the corner. Breakfast is served from 6 to 10. I wanted to ask about the building's history, but something in her demeanor discouraged conversation. Instead, I thanked her and made my way to the elevator, noting how the hallways stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that seemed to march into infinity. The elevator groaned as it climbed, each floor marked by a slight shudder that made me instinctively calculate load tolerances and structural integrity. When the doors finally opened on the second floor, I was greeted by a corridor that felt narrower than the lobby suggested, with carpet so thick it absorbed sound like a sponge. The walls were painted a faded green that reminded me uncomfortably of surgical scrubs. Room 247 sat at the end of the hall, isolated from its neighbors by what seemed like an unusual amount of space. The keycard took 3 attempts to work, and when the door finally clicked open, I was hit by a wave of air that felt somehow different. Not colder exactly, but carrying a weight that settled in my lungs like humidity. The room was larger than I'd expected, with 2 tall windows that overlooked the parking lot and, beyond it, a field that stretched to a line of skeletal trees. The bed sat in the center, flanked by nightstands that looked like they'd been repurposed from hospital equipment. I could see the modifications where wheels had been removed and new legs attached. The ceiling was higher than necessary for a hotel room, and I found myself wondering about the original purpose of this space. I unpacked methodically, a habit that helped me feel grounded in unfamiliar places. The thermal imaging camera went on the dresser next to my laptop, a piece of equipment I'd borrowed from the company for a project starting Monday. It was supposed to help identify heat loss in an old building downtown, but now it seemed like an oddly prophetic choice of gear. Dinner was a solitary affair in the hotel restaurant, where I was one of only 3 patrons. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, confirmed what I'd begun to suspect when I asked about the conversion from hospital to hotel. 20 years empty before they renovated, she said, refilling my water glass with hands that trembled slightly. Some folks say they should have left it that way. I pressed her for details, but she'd already moved on to clearing the neighboring table with an urgency that suggested our conversation was over. Back in my room, I tried to focus on work emails, but concentration proved elusive. The building seemed to settle around me with sounds that felt too deliberate to be random. Pipes groaned in sequences that almost resembled breathing. The heating system clicked on and off with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat. Even the ice machine down the hall seemed to cycle with unnatural regularity. By 11 o'clock, I'd given up on productivity and prepared for bed. The shower took longer than usual to produce hot water, and when it finally did, the pressure fluctuated in ways that made me check the fixtures for obvious problems. Everything appeared properly installed, but the water temperature continued to vary between scalding and lukewarm without any apparent pattern. I lay down finally, grateful for the darkness that hid the room's institutional details. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, and I was beginning to drift when I felt it, a subtle depression in the bed near my feet, as if someone had sat down carefully to avoid waking me. My eyes snapped open, but the room remained dark and empty. I waited, counting my heartbeats, until the sensation passed. When I shifted position, the mattress responded normally, with no sign of the depression I'd felt moments before. Sleep came in fragments after that. I dozed for what felt like minutes before being pulled back to consciousness by sounds that didn't quite make sense. Footsteps that stopped when I became fully alert. Whispers that might have been air conditioning, a sense of presence that vanished the moment I acknowledged it. Around 2 in the morning, it happened again. This time, the depression in the mattress was unmistakable, located about 3 feet from my right side. I held perfectly still, feeling the bed continue to sag as if someone were settling in for a long observation. The sensation lasted perhaps 30 seconds before gradually releasing, leaving me staring at the ceiling with my heart hammering against my ribs. I turned on the bedside lamp and examined the area where I'd felt the pressure. The mattress showed no signs of disturbance, no indentation that would suggest an external weight. I pressed down with my hand, watching the memory foam compress and slowly return to its original shape. Everything appeared normal, but the sensation had been too distinct to dismiss. The third occurrence came an hour later, followed by a fourth around 4 o'clock. Each time, the depression appeared in a slightly different location, sometimes near my feet, sometimes closer to my waist, always maintaining a distance that felt calculated. I began to recognize a pattern in the timing, roughly 60 to 90 minutes apart, as if something were keeping a schedule. By the 5th episode, I'd had enough of wondering. I retrieved the thermal imaging camera from the dresser, grateful for its silent operation as I powered it on and adjusted the settings. The device hummed quietly as it calibrated, its screen displaying a false color image of the room in blues and greens, with my own body heat glowing orange-red against the cool background. I pretended to sleep, keeping the camera hidden beneath the covers while monitoring its screen. The room appeared as expected, walls showing ambient temperature, windows slightly cooler where they met the outside air, heating vents registering as warm spots near the ceiling. My body created a bright thermal signature in the center of the bed, surrounded by the gradual heat dissipation that seemed perfectly normal. Then, at approximately 5:20 a.m., everything changed. The camera screen showed them clearly, 7 distinct cold spots arranged around the bed in precise formation. Each measured roughly 6 feet in length and appeared to hover about 3 feet above the floor. maintaining equal distances from each other and from my position in the center. The thermal signatures were unlike anything I'd seen before, registering as absolute cold against the ambient temperature of the room, as if they were absorbing heat rather than emitting it. I forced myself to remain motionless, watching as the cold signatures held their positions with military precision. They weren't random shapes. Each had the unmistakable outline of a human form lying horizontal, arms at sides, creating a perfect circle around my bed. The spacing between them was exactly what you'd expect between hospital beds in a ward, close enough for efficient care but far enough apart to provide minimal privacy. As I watched, one of the signatures began to change position, its form shifting from horizontal to vertical as if sitting up. The movement was slow and deliberate, and I realized with growing horror that this corresponded exactly to the sensation I'd been feeling throughout the night. The entity, whatever it was observing me, just as a medical professional might monitor a patient. The thermal camera didn't lie. It registered electromagnetic radiation, converting heat signatures into visual data through precise scientific measurement. There was no room for imagination or misinterpretation in its readings, yet the visual spectrum showed me nothing: no movement, no disturbance, no explanation for the 7 impossibly cold forms that surrounded my bed like sentries. One by one, the other signatures began to shift, rising from their horizontal positions into sitting arrangements. I watched through the camera as they oriented themselves toward me, their cold forms creating a pattern that spoke of organized observation. The temperatures were wrong, far too cold for human bodies, yet maintaining shapes that were unmistakably human in proportion and posture. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Equipment malfunction seemed most likely, but the camera had been calibrated that afternoon and showed no other anomalies. Air circulation patterns could create temperature variations, but not with such precise geometry. Structural elements might interfere with thermal readings, but the building's plans showed no utilities or support beams in those exact locations. I spent the remaining hours until dawn, watching the signatures maintain their vigil. They never moved beyond the subtle adjustments that aligned with the sensations I'd been feeling. The periodic sitting up, the careful settling that depressed the mattress, the unwavering attention that made my skin crawl with the certainty of being observed. When morning light finally crept through the windows, the thermal signatures faded gradually, dissolving into the ambient temperature as if they'd never existed. I saved the camera's data, downloading every frame to my laptop with the meticulous care of an engineer documenting a structural failure. Breakfast was a surreal experience. I sat in the hotel restaurant, surrounded by the mundane sounds of clinking silverware and casual conversation, while my laptop displayed thermal images that challenged everything I understood about reality. The data was irrefutable: 7 cold forms arranged in perfect medical formation around my bed, maintaining their positions for hours with the discipline of a military unit. The waitress from the previous evening approached my table with coffee, and I found myself studying her face for signs of knowledge she wasn't sharing. When I mentioned having trouble sleeping, she glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Room 247 was the trauma ward," she whispered, filling my cup with hands that shook more noticeably in the morning light. "They say some folks never checked out." I pressed her for more information, but she'd already retreated to the safety of other tables and routine service. Other guests came and went, eating their continental breakfast with the casual indifference of people who'd slept peacefully in rooms that had once held dying soldiers. I spent the morning researching the building's history, finding references to St. Catherine's Military Hospital buried in municipal records and veteran organization websites. The facility had operated from 1923 to 1995, treating wounded servicemen through 3 major conflicts and countless smaller actions. Room 247 had indeed been a trauma ward, designed for critical cases that required constant monitoring. The renovation records showed that the hotel conversion had preserved the original room layouts, maintaining the spatial relationships that had once facilitated medical care. The distances between beds, the sight lines for nursing stations, the circulation patterns that allowed quick access to emergency equipment, all had been incorporated into the new design with minimal modification. But none of this explained the thermal signatures I'd recorded. Dead men didn't generate electromagnetic radiation. Empty air couldn't maintain precise geometric arrangements. The camera had documented something that shouldn't exist, yet the data remained stubbornly present on my hard drive, challenging my worldview with each reviewed frame. I left the hotel that afternoon with a checkout process that seemed deliberately expedited. The desk clerk barely looked up as she processed my departure, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone eager to complete an unpleasant task. When I mentioned the room's history, she simply shrugged and wished me a pleasant drive home. The thermal camera sits on my desk now, back in my office where structural calculations and building codes provide comfortable boundaries for reality. But the data remains, backed up in multiple locations with timestamps and metadata that confirm its authenticity. 7 cold forms arranged in perfect medical formation, maintaining their vigil through the darkest hours of the night. My colleagues have returned from their corporate retreat with stories of mediocre room service and inadequate Wi-Fi. They ask about my accommodations with the casual interest of people making conversation, and I find myself deflecting with remarks about thin walls and outdated plumbing. Because how do you explain that you've documented something impossible? How do you reconcile scientific data with phenomena that shouldn't exist? The thermal camera doesn't interpret or imagine, it simply records what is there. Yet what it recorded challenges every rational explanation I can construct. Sometimes, late at night in my own bed, I feel phantom depressions in the mattress that make me reach for the camera I keep on my nightstand. The readings show nothing unusual, just the normal heat patterns of a suburban bedroom. But the sensation lingers, along with the memory of 7 cold forms maintaining their eternal watch. I've considered returning to the hotel, if only to confirm that the experience was isolated to that single night. But I haven't been able to bring myself to make the reservation. Some part of me fears what the camera might show during a second visit, whether the data would remain consistent or reveal even more unsettling details about the nature of what I observed. The rational part of my mind insists there must be an explanation. Equipment failure, environmental anomalies, psychological suggestion combined with sleep deprivation. But the engineer in me trusts data over theories, and the data tells a story that my worldview cannot accommodate. So I continue to examine the thermal images, frame by frame, looking for clues that might provide a conventional explanation. The cold signatures remain as mysterious as they were that first morning, 7 precise forms arranged in perfect formation around a bed that once held dying soldiers who may never have learned to let go of their duty. And sometimes, in the quiet hours when rational thought gives way to darker possibilities, I wonder if they're still there, maintaining their vigil in room 247, waiting patiently for the next guest who might need their care, or their warning, or simply their witness to the thin places where the past refuses to remain buried. Story 5. The first time I saw her, I thought my camera had malfunctioned. I'd been documenting the restoration of the Blackwood estate for 3 weeks, capturing every peeling wallpaper curl and cracked ceiling medallion for the Historical Society's archives. The Victorian mansion had stood empty for 40 years, and the renovation crew needed comprehensive before and after shots. It was routine work, the kind that paid the bills while I waited for something more meaningful to come along. The mirrors had been giving me trouble all morning. Not technically, my equipment was functioning perfectly, but practically. Every room seemed to have at least 2, some elaborate gilt-framed monsters that dominated entire walls, others modest vanity pieces tucked into corners. Shooting around reflective surfaces requires careful positioning, constant awareness of angles. I'd grown accustomed to seeing my own reflection pop up unexpectedly in shots, requiring reshoot after reshoot. But in the main parlor's towering mirror, bordered by carved roses that time had turned the color of dried blood, I saw something that made me lower my camera with trembling hands. There was a woman standing behind me. I spun around immediately, heart hammering against my ribs. The room was empty. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light streaming through grimy windows. The only sounds were the distant hammering of workers in the West Wing and the settling groans of old wood adjusting to human presence after decades of solitude. I turned back to the mirror, studying my own reflection with the intensity of a man seeing himself for the first time. Alone, Just me, cameras slung across my body, standing in an empty room. But when I raised my camera again and looked through the viewfinder at the mirror's reflection, she was there. The woman wore what appeared to be a uniform, dark fabric with pale trim that could have been from any era in the house's long history. A maid's dress, perhaps, or a nurse's outfit from when the place had briefly served as a private sanitarium in the 1920s. Her face was indistinct, features blurred as if the mirror itself was slightly out of focus, but her posture was rigid, formal, professional, and she was moving. Not independently. That realization crawled up my spine like cold fingers. She was mirroring my movements, but not simultaneously. When I shifted my weight to my left foot, she followed a few seconds later. When I adjusted my camera strap, she echoed the gesture after a noticeable delay, like a poor internet connection creating lag in a video call. I convinced myself it was an optical illusion. Old glass, warped by age and temperature fluctuations. The human brain's tendency to find patterns and faces in random configurations. I'd read about pareidolia, the phenomenon that makes us see Jesus in toast or faces in clouds. This was just stress, exhaustion, too many solitary hours in a house that seemed to exhale sadness from every pore. I finished photographing the parlor without looking at the mirror again, but in the library, she appeared in the reflection of the glass-fronted bookcases. In the dining room, she materialized in the silver surface of a tarnished serving tray. The master bedroom's vanity mirror showed her most clearly of all, standing exactly where I stood, wearing that same indistinct uniform, following my movements with that increasingly unsettling delay. I began timing the lag. 3 seconds in the parlor, 2.5 in the library, 2 seconds flat in the dining room. By the time I reached the master bedroom, the delay had shortened to perhaps 1.5 seconds. The pattern was unmistakable, and it filled me with a dread I couldn't rationalize. I left early that day, claiming equipment troubles to the foreman. At home, I downloaded the day's images, examining each one with forensic intensity. The woman never appeared in the actual photographs. Only when I looked at reflective surfaces directly, or through my camera's viewfinder in real time. The digital files showed only empty rooms and my own solitary figure. That night, I researched the Blackwood estate's history with the obsessive focus of a man trying to solve his own sanity. The records were incomplete, frustratingly vague. The house had changed hands multiple times, serving various purposes: private residence, boarding house, sanitarium, girls' school. There were gaps in the timeline, periods where the property seemed to exist in administrative limbo. I found one newspaper clipping from 1934, barely legible even in the digitized archive. Mysterious circumstances surrounding the departure of staff, authorities investigating claims of irregularities in patient care. The article cut off abruptly, as if the rest had been deliberately removed. Nothing about a woman in uniform. Nothing that explained why reflective surfaces in that house seemed to operate by different rules than the rest of reality. I returned the next morning with a small handheld mirror, telling myself I was conducting an experiment. Scientific method. If the phenomenon was real, it would be reproducible. If it was psychological, facing it directly might break whatever spell my mind had woven. In the front hall, I held up the mirror and watched myself watch myself. Nothing unusual, just my own face, stubbled and drawn from a sleepless night, staring back with bloodshot eyes. Then I angled the mirror to reflect the larger mirror hanging on the opposite wall. A mirror reflecting a mirror, infinity stretching backward in diminishing repetitions of the same image. She was there, in every iteration, standing behind me in perfect formation, like an army of uniformed women receding into forever. And in each reflection, the delay was different. The nearest image showed her perhaps a full second behind my movements. The next showed her slightly ahead. Further back, she seemed to move in perfect synchronization with me. And in the very last visible reflection, the one so distant it was barely a speck of movement in the infinite regression, she was moving first. I let the mirror drop from nerveless fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sound like breaking ice. For the rest of that day, I avoided all reflective surfaces, I covered my camera's LCD screen with tape, shot everything in the viewfinder mode, and kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. But avoidance proved impossible in a house where Victorian excess had demanded mirrors in every room, where windows threw back images in daylight hours, where even the brass doorknobs and crystal chandeliers caught and reflected distorted fragments of light and shadow. And she was always there, waiting. The delay was shrinking with each encounter. By noon, it was down to perhaps half a second. By afternoon, it was barely perceptible. She moved almost simultaneously with my own actions, like a reflection that was learning to be real time. I started speaking to the foreman about mundane things, weather, construction delays, anything to hear a human voice that wasn't my own internal monologue growing increasingly frantic. He mentioned casually that the previous photographer had quit without explanation after only 2 days on the job, and the one before that had completed just 1 day before claiming a family emergency required his immediate departure. Neither had finished the documentation work. The third day, I arrived with a specific purpose. I positioned myself in the master bedroom, facing the vanity mirror directly, and spoke aloud to my reflection. To both of us. The words felt strange in my mouth, addressing something that might not exist to anyone but me. I asked who she was. I asked what she wanted. I asked if she was real. My reflection moved its mouth soundlessly. Hers remained perfectly still. But when I raised my right hand, she raised her left. Mirror image perfect. When I tilted my head, she tilted hers in the exact opposite direction. We were synchronized now, moving together with mechanical precision, except for her eyes. While our bodies moved in perfect reflected harmony, her eyes remained fixed on something just over my shoulder, something behind me. I followed her gaze in the mirror, turning to look at what had captured her attention so completely. The room was empty, but when I turned back to the mirror, she was no longer looking behind me. She was looking directly at me, through the glass, into my eyes with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thick and difficult to breathe. And for the first time I could see her face clearly. It was my face, not similar. Not a resemblance that could be explained by poor lighting or artistic interpretation. It was exactly my face, wearing an expression of desperate warning that I'd never seen in my own mirror before. The uniform was wrong. Everything about the figure was wrong. But the face was undeniably, impossibly mine. I stumbled backward, knocking over a paint can the workers had left behind. White latex spread across the hardwood floors in an expanding pool, and I watched in the mirror as my other self, my uniformed self, stepped carefully around an identical spill that existed only in reflection. The synchronization was perfect now. Every movement matched exactly, but I wasn't controlling both sets of actions anymore. Sometimes I moved first, sometimes the reflection did. We were taking turns being real. I ran then, fled the house with my equipment half packed, leaving behind cameras and lenses worth thousands of dollars. The foreman called after me, concerned about my pallor, my obvious distress, but I couldn't stop to explain what couldn't be explained. At home, I avoided mirrors for days, brushed my teeth staring at the wall, shaved by touch alone. But eventually, inevitably, I caught my reflection in the bathroom medicine cabinet and saw myself wearing a dark uniform with pale trim, moving with the precise professional bearing of domestic staff from another era. I was staring at my own reflection, which was staring back with eyes full of terrified recognition. The Blackwood estate called twice to ask when I'd return to finish the documentation. I let the calls go to voicemail. A week later, they called to ask about retrieving my equipment. I told them to donate it to charity. The final call came from the Historical Society. They'd found something during the renovation, hidden in a wall cavity behind the master bedroom's vanity mirror. Personal effects from a previous renovation in 1934, including a photographer's plates and camera equipment. The glass plates showed room after room of the house, shot from angles identical to my own work. In every photograph, standing in backgrounds and corners, barely visible in the silver gelatin grain, was a figure in uniform, the same uniform I'd been seeing in mirrors, the same face I'd been seeing in reflections. My face. They wanted to know if I was related to the previous photographer. The one whose name was recorded as my exact name, spelled identically, whose signature on the work order matched my own handwriting with unsettling precision. I told them I'd never heard of any relative who shared my name. But late at night, when I can't avoid catching glimpses of myself in dark windows or polished surfaces, I see that I'm still wearing the uniform, still standing in perfect synchronization with a man who thinks he's real, who thinks he's looking at his reflection instead of being one. And I know that somewhere, a photographer is documenting a house renovation, growing increasingly disturbed by a figure in mirrors who moves just slightly out of sync with reality. Someone who looks exactly like him, wearing clothes from another era, trapped in reflections that remember everything even when the world forgets. The delay is shrinking for him too. Soon, it will disappear entirely. And then he'll understand what I've learned. We're all reflections of someone else's life, someone else's choices, someone else's reality. The question isn't whether what we see in mirrors is real. The question is whether we are. Story 6. The silence never lasted long enough. I'd moved into the annex 3 months ago, drawn by the rent price that seemed too good for downtown, and the landlord's nervous insistence that I wouldn't mind a little character in the building. The structure perched above what had been Kellerman's Forge in the 1890s, and the realtor had made a point of mentioning the historical significance, as if it justified the creaking floors and windows that wouldn't quite seal shut. What she hadn't mentioned was the noise. It started the first week, always when I needed absolute quiet for work. I'm a technical writer. Dry stuff, user manuals, and software documentation that requires laser focus. The kind of concentration that evaporates the moment you realize you're not alone in the silence. The first time I thought it was construction next door. 3 measured strikes from below, metal on metal, echoing up through the floorboards with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. Then nothing for 20 minutes. Then 5 rapid taps, followed by 2 deliberate pounds. I'd gone downstairs to investigate, but the forge space had been converted into storage for the landlord's antique business. Dust motes danced in shafts of amber light between towers of furniture draped in white sheets. The massive anvil still dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred by decades of use, but no one had touched it in years. The layer of dust confirmed that. Back upstairs, I'd tried to work again. The moment my fingers found their rhythm on the keyboard, the hammering resumed. By the 3rd week, I'd started to recognize patterns. The strikes weren't random. They followed sequences, deliberate and measured like Morse code, but more complex. 3 short, pause. 2 long, pause. 1 sharp crack that seemed to split the air itself. Sometimes the patterns repeated. Sometimes they evolved, building on previous sequences as if someone below was teaching me a language I didn't want to learn. I'd mentioned it to the landlord during a chance encounter in the building's cramped lobby. Marcus Kellerman, great-grandson of the original blacksmith according to his business card, had developed a twitch in his left eye when I brought up the noise. "Old buildings settle," he'd said, not quite meeting my gaze. Especially ones with this much history. The way he'd hesitated before that last word had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. "Have other tenants mentioned anything unusual?" His laugh had come out strangled. "You're the first tenant to last more than 6 weeks in 20 years. I should have moved out then. Should have packed my laptop and few belongings and found somewhere with thin walls and noisy neighbors, anywhere the silence wouldn't feel like a held breath waiting to be shattered. Instead, I'd become obsessed with the patterns. I started documenting them, transcribing each sequence into a notebook with timestamps and duration. The strikes followed a logic I couldn't grasp, but felt hovering just beyond comprehension, like trying to remember a word that sits on the tip of your tongue. Some sequences lasted minutes, others mere seconds, but they all carried the same deliberate intent. The breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating afternoon when I'd been trying to finish a user manual for enterprise software. The hammering had been constant for an hour, complex rhythms that seemed to build toward something, crescendoing and then starting over as if I'd missed some crucial response. In a moment of desperation or madness, I'd grabbed my own hammer from the toolbox under the kitchen sink and struck back. 3 measured blows against the hardwood floor, matching the last sequence I'd heard. The silence that followed felt different, expectant rather than empty. Then, from below, came a new pattern. Slow and deliberate, each strike separated by exactly 3 seconds. It repeated 4 times before stopping. I wrote it down, my hand trembling slightly as I recorded what felt like the first exchange in a conversation I wasn't sure I wanted to continue. But I did continue. Every day, the patterns became more sophisticated. What started as simple call and response evolved into something that resembled instruction. The entity, I'd stopped pretending it was just settling wood or phantom construction, would present a sequence, wait for me to respond, then provide a variation or correction. Like lessons, like someone was teaching me to forge something that existed beyond the physical realm. The realization came gradually, building through weeks of transcribed patterns until the purpose crystallized with horrible clarity. I wasn't learning random sequences. I was learning to craft a key. Not one that would open locks or doors, but something that could unlock silence itself. The patterns were instructions for creating an object that existed in the space between sound and emptiness, forged from intention rather than metal. My notebook had filled with increasingly complex diagrams, sketches of impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly, measurements that seemed to shift when I wasn't paying attention. The sequences had evolved beyond simple hammer strikes to include duration, intensity, even the angle of impact. Each element mattered in ways I understood viscerally, but couldn't articulate. The night I finally attempted to forge the key, the building felt different. The air had thickened, carrying a metallic taste that coated my throat and made breathing feel laborious. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak more deliberate. The silence between hammer strikes stretched like elastic, threatening to snap back with accumulated tension. I worked for 3 hours, following the patterns I'd learned, striking the floor in sequences that felt both foreign and familiar. My neighbors, if I still had any, would think I'd lost my mind, beating the floor with a hammer at midnight like some deranged percussion performance. But the key took shape. Not physically. There was nothing to see or touch. But I felt it forming in the space around me, a presence that existed in the gaps between moments. A skeleton key crafted from intention and repetition, designed to lock away the sounds that had been driving me toward the edge of sanity. When I finally used it, a mental gesture I couldn't explain but somehow knew how to perform, the silence that followed was absolute. Pure, the kind of quiet I'd been craving since the day I'd moved in. It lasted exactly 72 hours. Then the hammering returned, and with it came the understanding that I'd been played. The key hadn't silenced the noise. It had given the entity below what it needed. The patterns I'd learned and replicated had been far more than instructions for crafting silence. They'd been a summoning. The strikes now came with a weight that pressed against my chest, each impact reverberating through the building's bones in ways that defied physics. The sequences had evolved beyond anything I could follow, becoming a symphony of intent that spoke of hunger barely contained. Whatever lived in the space below had been waiting for someone to complete the ritual, to forge the connection that would allow it to reach beyond the boundaries of its prison. I tried to leave, packed my belongings twice, called moving companies, even put down deposits on other apartments. But each time I reached the threshold, the hammering would begin again, urgent now, demanding, with an undertone that suggested terrible consequences for abandonment. The patterns had become commands. During the day, I could sometimes convince myself it was stress, isolation, the psychological pressure of living above a space soaked in decades of industrial violence. The rational mind has remarkable flexibility when it comes to explaining away the impossible. But at night, when the building settled into its true shape and the membrane between worlds grew thin, I knew better. The entity below wasn't just communicating. It was teaching me new lessons, more complex forgings, keys that would open doors I couldn't see but somehow knew led to places where silence wasn't golden, but ravenous. My notebook had become a grimoire of sorts, filled with sequences that seemed to writhe on the page when viewed peripherally. The handwriting looked less like mine with each passing day, the letters elongating and curving in ways that suggested influence beyond my conscious control. I'd stopped trying to work. The technical writing felt absurd now, creating documentation for software that helped people organize their ordinary lives, while I learned to craft implements for purposes I couldn't name, but feared to understand. The hammering had become constant, no longer confined to moments when I sought silence. It followed its own schedule now, sometimes gentle and almost conversational, other times urgent and demanding, always purposeful, always teaching. And I was learning. God help me, I was still learning. The key I'd forged had been just the beginning, a simple exercise to test my aptitude before moving on to more sophisticated tools. Each new lesson built upon the last, creating an arsenal of impossible implements designed for tasks that existed in the spaces between thoughts. I'd become a student in a curriculum I couldn't quit, bound to an instructor whose lessons grew more complex with each passing day. The forge below wasn't empty. It had never been empty. It was a classroom, and I was the first pupil to demonstrate sufficient aptitude to advance beyond the preliminary exercises. The latest sequence had lasted 14 hours, a complex rhythm that seemed to reshape the building around it. The walls had whispered, the windows had hummed, and the floorboards had sung in harmonies that made my teeth ache. When it finally ended, I'd found new diagrams in my notebook, blueprints for creating something that looked almost like a door, but functioned more like an invitation. Tonight, I'm supposed to attempt the forging. The patterns are clear, the measurements precise, the timing critical. I understand now why previous tenants had lasted only weeks. They'd lacked the patience to complete their education, abandoning their studies before reaching the advanced coursework. But I'm a diligent student. I take excellent notes. I follow instructions with mechanical precision. And somewhere in the space between learning and madness, I've begun to suspect that the hammering isn't coming from below at all. It's coming from above. Someone else lives in this building, someone who moved in after I did and started the lessons I've been so carefully following. The entity below isn't the teacher. It's another student, one who's been here much longer and progressed far beyond my current level. The realization should terrify me, but instead it brings a strange sense of relief. I'm not alone in this education. I'm not the first to be chosen for advanced study. As I prepare for tonight's lesson, hammer in hand and notebook open to the latest sequence, I can hear footsteps in the apartment above. Measured, deliberate, following a rhythm I'm beginning to recognize. The true teacher has been with me all along, patient and methodical, waiting for me to progress far enough to recognize the source of my instruction. I raise the hammer, ready to begin tonight's exercise in impossible craftsmanship. The footsteps above shift into the familiar pattern of 3 short, 2 long, 1 sharp crack. Class is in session. Story 7. The Hartwell property had been on the market for 8 months when I first stepped through its front door. 8 months of price cuts and failed inspections, of buyers who walked away after 20 minutes without explanation. The seller, Marcus Hartwell, insisted the house was perfect. Fresh paint throughout, new fixtures, immaculate condition. But houses don't linger like wounded animals unless something's wrong. The smell hit me before I'd even finished my introduction. Smoke, not the pleasant woodsy scent of a fireplace, but something acrid and wrong, like burning plastic mixed with charred meat. It clung to the air in the narrow hallway that connected the living room to the kitchen, a space barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. I paused mid-sentence, my prepared speech about square footage dying on my lips. "Everything all right?" Hartwell asked, though his eyes darted away from mine when he spoke. He was a thin man in his 50s, with the kind of nervous energy that made him constantly adjust his collar and smooth down hair that wasn't out of place. I pulled out my phone's flashlight, a habit from years of showing dimly lit properties. The beam cut through the afternoon shadows, and that's when I saw them. Black patterns covered the walls, intricate arabesques that twisted and curved like Arabic calligraphy or ancient Celtic knots. They weren't painted. They seemed to emerge from the white surface itself, as if the wall had been scorched from within. The designs pulsed gently in the flashlight's glow, expanding and contracting like living tissue. "The walls," I began, but Hartwell was already shaking his head. "White throughout the house," he said quickly. "Fresh coat last month. Benjamin Moore's Swiss coffee. You can check the receipt if you want." I blinked hard and looked again. The walls were white, pristine, unmarked white, but the smell remained. "Must be something in the ventilation," I muttered, though I'd never encountered anything like it. "When did you last have the HVAC serviced?" Hartwell's laugh was too sharp, too quick. "Just last week. Everything's in perfect working order." I spent the next hour going through the motions, measuring rooms, testing faucets, noting the crown molding and hardwood floors that should have made this place an easy sell. But every time I passed through that hallway, my skin crawled. The acrid smell would intensify, and I'd catch glimpses of those black patterns in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly, I saw only white walls. Back in my car, I sat for several minutes before starting the engine. The October afternoon had grown cold, and my breath fogged the windshield as I tried to process what had happened. Real estate agents develop a sixth sense about houses. Which ones have foundation issues? Which ones have been lived in by smokers? Which ones hold sadness in their walls like moisture? But this was different. I pulled out my notebook, a leather-bound pad I'd used for years to sketch floor plans and jot down selling points. Without really thinking about it, I began to draw. My hand moved across the page in smooth, confident strokes, tracing curves and spirals that seemed to flow from memory. The pattern emerged line by line, an intricate arabesque that covered half the page. It was beautiful, in a way that made my chest tight. That night, I dreamed of smoke. The next morning brought 3 new listings and a closing that should have occupied my full attention. But I found myself thinking about the Hartwell house, about those impossible patterns that existed only when I wasn't looking directly at them. During lunch, I called 2 colleagues who specialized in older properties, asking casual questions about weird smells and wall discoloration. Neither had encountered anything similar. I tried to push it from my mind, but by evening, I was back in my car, driving toward the Hartwell property. The house looked different in the dying light, smaller somehow, as if it had hunched in on itself. I sat across the street, studying the windows for signs of life. Hartwell had mentioned he was staying elsewhere while the house was on the market. Something about wanting to give potential buyers space to envision their own lives in the rooms. My notebook lay on the passenger seat, and I could swear I felt heat radiating from it. I picked it up with careful fingers and opened to the page where I'd drawn the pattern. The ink seemed darker than it had been, the lines more defined. As I watched, the design appeared to shift slightly, the curves deepening and the spirals tightening. A faint smoky smell began to fill the car. I dropped the notebook and rolled down the windows, gasping in the cool evening air. When I looked back at the page, it was just ink on paper, but the smell lingered. Over the next week, I showed the Hartwell house to 3 different clients. Each time, I steeled myself for the hallway, for the smell and the patterns that shouldn't exist. But nothing happened. The walls remained white, the air clear. My clients commented on the excellent condition, the quality of the renovation work, the competitive price. "Why hasn't this sold?" asked a young couple on Thursday afternoon. They stood in the living room, practically glowing with the excitement of first-time buyers. "Sometimes it just takes the right people," I told them, though even as I said it, I knew they wouldn't make an offer. They'd find reasons. The kitchen was too small. The bedrooms faced the wrong direction. The neighborhood wasn't quite right. The house would reject them, the way it had rejected every other potential buyer. That night, I called Hartwell. "I need to ask you something," I said when he answered. "Have you ever noticed anything unusual about the hallway? Any smells or—" The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "You're the first," he said finally. "The first to mention it." "The first to mention what?" "The fire." My mouth went dry. "What fire?" "The one that happened in 1987, previous owners. Started in the hallway, spread to the kitchen before they got it under control. No one was hurt, but..." His voice trailed off. But what? The insurance investigator couldn't determine the cause. No electrical problems, no candles, no obvious ignition source. The fire just started, in the walls themselves. I thought about the patterns, the way they seemed to emerge from within the paint. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because it's not relevant, Hartwell said quickly. Everything was repaired, rebuilt to code. I've lived here for 15 years without incident. The fire has nothing to do with why the house won't sell. But I knew he was lying, to me and to himself. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen with the notebook open before me. The arabesque pattern covered the page completely now. I was certain it had grown. The lines were bolder, more complex, branching into fractals that hurt to follow with my eyes. I touched the page with one finger and the paper felt warm. The smell of smoke filled my kitchen. I slammed the notebook shut and shoved it into a drawer, but I could still sense it there, like a small fire smoldering in the darkness. The next day, I received a call from a client interested in the Hartwell property. Margaret Chen, a professor of art history at the local university. She wanted to see it that afternoon. I'm particularly interested in Islamic geometric patterns, she explained as we walked through the front door. I understand the house has some interesting architectural details. I led her through the rooms, pointing out the original molding and refinished floors, but my attention kept drifting to the hallway. As we approached it, I braced myself for the smell, for the patterns that weren't there. Professor Chen stopped dead in the corridor entrance. "Extraordinary," she whispered. The walls were covered in black arabesques, not the simple pattern I'd seen before, but an incredibly complex design that seemed to flow and shift even as I watched. The smell of smoke was overwhelming, and I could hear a faint crackling sound, like paper burning. "You can see them?" I asked. She nodded, pulling out her phone to take pictures. Remarkable craftsmanship. These patterns are hundreds of years old, traditional Islamic geometric designs, but the execution is unusual. They appear to be burned directly into the surface rather than painted or carved. I watched her move closer to the wall, studying the details with professional fascination. "Professor Chen, I don't think you should." "The mathematical precision is incredible," she continued, running her finger along one of the curves. "Each element perfectly proportioned, the repetition extending infinitely in all directions. It's like looking at a visual representation of eternity." The moment her skin touched the wall, the patterns began to move more rapidly. The smell of smoke intensified, and I heard something that might have been whispers, or might have been the sound of flames consuming wood. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing her arm. She looked at me in confusion. "Leave? But I've only just begun to study." "Now." I pulled her toward the door, my heart pounding. Behind us, I heard the crackling grow louder, and the air grew thick with heat that shouldn't exist. In the car, Professor Chen scrolled through the photos on her phone with a puzzled expression. "That's odd," she said. "They're all blank, just white walls." I drove her back to the university in silence, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. That evening, I returned to the Hartwell house alone. I had to know. The notebook lay on my passenger seat, and I could feel its presence like a weight in my chest. The front door was unlocked. I was almost certain I'd locked it after showing the house to Professor Chen, but my memory felt unreliable, fractured by the day's events. The hallway waited for me in the darkness. I switched on my flashlight, and the patterns were there immediately, not just covering the walls now, but spreading across the ceiling and down onto the floor. The entire corridor pulsed with black fire, and the smell of smoke was so strong I could taste it. I opened my notebook with shaking hands. The arabesque design had spread across multiple pages now, the pattern becoming more and more complex. As I watched, new lines appeared, drawing themselves in ink that seemed to burn as it flowed. The whispers were clearer now. Not English, not any language I recognized, but somehow I understood. They spoke of fire that burned without consuming, of patterns that existed between dimensions, of walls that remembered everything that had ever happened within them. I began to copy the design from the walls into my notebook, my hand moving without conscious direction. Each line I drew made the patterns on the walls glow brighter, made the whispers grow louder. The smoke smell filled my lungs, but I couldn't stop drawing. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt fluid in that burning corridor. When I finally looked up, dawn light was creeping through the windows. The walls were white again, pristine and innocent. My notebook was full of intricate patterns that seemed to writhe on the page. I closed the book and walked to my car on unsteady legs. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't returned to the Hartwell house, though I drive past it sometimes and see other real estate agents showing it to new clients. The for sale sign still stands in the front yard, slightly crooked now, as if the earth itself is rejecting it. The notebook sits in my desk drawer at home. I haven't opened it since that night, but I can feel it calling to me, especially in the early hours before dawn when the world is quiet and the smell of smoke sometimes drifts through my house. Sometimes I think about Professor Chen's words, patterns representing eternity, mathematics made visible, infinity extending in all directions. Sometimes I wonder if the fire in 1987 ever really ended, if it's been burning all this time in spaces between the walls, in dimensions our eyes can't normally see. And sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I think about opening the notebook again, about studying those patterns until I understand their meaning, until I can see the fire that burns without consuming, until I know what the whispers are trying to tell me. The Hartwell house is still for sale. It always will be. But I don't think it's really empty anymore. Story 8. The cameras were Sarah's idea. 3 weeks of sleepless nights had worn us both thin, and the persistent sensation that something moved in our yard after dark had become impossible to ignore. The rational part of my mind insisted it was raccoons or maybe a neighbor's cat, but the primal fear that settled in my chest each evening suggested otherwise. I installed the first camera on a Tuesday morning, mounting it beneath the eaves where it could survey most of our backyard. The device felt substantial in my hands, black metal and glass that promised answers to questions I wasn't sure I wanted to ask. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as I tested the night vision, her coffee growing cold while I adjusted angles and checked wireless signals. The footage from that first night changed everything. At 3:47 a.m., the infrared display showed our familiar yard, the oak tree Sarah's grandmother had planted 40 years ago, the wooden fence separating our property from the Hendersons next door, the small vegetable garden we'd neglected since moving in 6 months earlier. Normal, static, peaceful. Then, at 3:48 a.m., the earth began to move. It started as a subtle disturbance near the garden's edge, soil shifting upward as if something pushed from below. Within minutes, the disturbance had grown into a distinct mound, roughly 3 feet in diameter, rising like bread dough in time-lapse photography. The infrared captured every detail with surgical clarity. Clods of earth tumbling down the sides, the surface rippling with an organic rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. Sarah and I watched the recording 3 times before either of us spoke. She finally suggested we check the yard, though dawn was still hours away. I grabbed a flashlight and followed her outside, my bare feet immediately regretting the decision as dew soaked through my socks. The mound stood exactly where the camera had shown it, chest high and irregular, like a fresh grave viewed in negative. I circled it slowly, playing my flashlight beam across its surface. The soil appeared recently disturbed, but there was no obvious source for the displaced earth. Our small garden showed no corresponding depression, no hole where dirt might have been borrowed. Sarah reached the same conclusion first. She knelt beside the mound and began digging with her hands, scooping away loose earth with the focused intensity she usually reserved for her crossword puzzles. I joined her, using a small gardening spade we'd left on the back porch. The soil came away easily, almost eagerly, as if it wanted to be moved. 3 feet down, we found nothing. Not nothing in the sense of hitting bedrock or clay. Nothing in the sense of empty space that seemed to extend further than our flashlight could penetrate. I lowered my arm into the hole until my shoulder pressed against ground level, feeling for a bottom that never came. Cool air moved against my skin with the steady rhythm of slow, deep breathing. Sarah's face had gone pale in the flashlight's glow. She suggested we fill it in and pretend we'd never seen it, but curiosity had already taken hold of me like a fever. I wanted to understand what we'd discovered, needed to know if this was some natural phenomenon or something else entirely. We spent the rest of the night watching from our bedroom window. The mound's breathing became more pronounced as dawn approached, its surface rising and falling with hypnotic regularity. Then, as the first gray light touched our fence line, it began to sink. Not collapse, sink, as if the earth below was slowly inhaling the entire structure. By full sunrise, only bare ground remained. The second night brought another mound in a different location, this time near the oak tree. The same impossible emergence, the same hollow core, the same breathing rhythm that seemed to match my own pulse when I concentrated on it. I found myself synchronizing my breathing with the earth's rhythm without conscious thought, a habit that left me feeling dizzy and disconnected. By the fourth night, we documented 7 separate mounds appearing in various locations around our yard. Each left behind the same bottomless hole, each breathed with the same steady cadence. Sarah had stopped watching the recordings, claiming they gave her headaches, but I found myself reviewing them obsessively, searching for patterns that danced just beyond comprehension. The turning point came when I decided to fill one of the holes with concrete. Sarah thought it was overkill, but the breathing earth had begun appearing in my dreams, and I needed to prove to myself that this was a solvable problem. I bought 3 bags of quick-set concrete from the hardware store and mixed them in our wheelbarrow, creating enough material to fill several holes completely. The mound that night appeared near our back fence, larger than previous ones and breathing so deeply that I could hear it from our bedroom. A soft, rhythmic sound like wind moving through distant caves. I waited until it reached full size, then carried my concrete outside in a large bucket. The hole accepted the concrete with the same eager passivity it had shown for our earlier excavations. I poured until the mixture reached ground level, then smoothed the surface with a trowel. The breathing stopped immediately, as if I'd plugged the earth's nostril. I felt proud of my solution until the next morning, when I discovered a new mound on the opposite side of our house, in a section of yard we'd never seen disturbed before. This mound was different, larger, more complex in shape, and crowned with objects that made my breath catch in my throat. Sarah's college ring, which she'd lost during our move, sat half buried in the peak of freshly turned soil. Next to it, my father's reading glasses, the pair he'd been wearing when he died 2 years ago, which I'd kept in a drawer until they'd mysteriously disappeared a month after the funeral. Sarah found her grandmother's wedding dress tangled in the roots of the oak tree, still wrapped in the yellowed tissue paper we'd stored it in before the fabric had vanished from our closet. I discovered my high school baseball glove buried beneath a layer of soil near our front steps, still carrying the scent of leather oil in summer afternoons despite having been missing for over a decade. The earth was returning things to us. Things we'd lost, things we'd forgotten, things we'd never expected to see again. Each emergence brought new treasures and new questions that carved themselves deeper into my consciousness. How did these objects travel through solid ground? Where had they been stored during their absence? And why were they coming back now? I stopped sleeping properly. Every sound in the house became potential evidence of movement. Every creak in the floorboards a sign that the breathing earth had somehow found its way inside. Sarah started taking longer showers and spending extended periods grocery shopping, though she never brought home more than a few items. Our conversations became careful negotiations around topics we both recognized, but refused to name directly. The breathing grew louder. What had started as a subtle rhythm, audible only during the deepest part of night, gradually became a constant presence, like living next to a freeway or beneath an airport flight path. I found myself holding my breath to better hear the earth's rhythm, then gasping when my lungs demanded air. The synchronization between my breathing and the yards became so complete that I sometimes couldn't tell which of us was setting the pace. Sarah mentioned seeing mounds during daylight hours, small ones that appeared and disappeared between her glances out the kitchen window. I installed additional cameras to capture these anomalies, but the recording showed only normal yard activity: birds, squirrels, the play of shadows across grass. Yet Sarah's descriptions were so detailed, so specific, that I began to wonder if the cameras were somehow failing to record what was actually happening. The objects kept coming. Sarah's grandmother's china, piece by piece, emerging from different mounds like treasures from a sunken ship. My mother's jewelry, still in its original boxes despite having been buried with her 5 years ago. Books I'd owned as a child, their pages unmarked by soil despite having spent unknown time underground. I started mapping the emergence patterns, tracking which areas produced which types of objects. Personal items appeared near the house itself, while family heirlooms emerged closer to the property's borders. The most valuable discoveries came from the deepest mounds, those that breathed most heavily and took longest to dissolve at dawn. The pattern suggested intelligence, purpose, as if something below was carefully selecting which memories to return, which pieces of our past deserved resurrection. Sarah began talking about moving. She'd found a rental property across town, she said, somewhere we could start fresh without the constant sensation of being watched from below. But the idea of leaving filled me with panic I couldn't rationally explain. What if the breathing earth followed us? What if it kept our treasures hostage until we returned? What if this was happening only to us, in this specific place, and moving would mean losing our connection to something larger than ourselves? I convinced her to stay another week. That week brought the most disturbing discovery yet. A mound appeared directly beneath our bedroom window, larger than any previous emergence, and breathing so heavily that our entire house seemed to pulse with its rhythm. When I excavated the resulting hole, I found a wooden box I'd never seen before, carved with symbols that looked almost familiar, but remained just beyond recognition. Inside the box were photographs, pictures of Sarah and me in locations we'd never visited, engaged in activities we'd never performed, images of our wedding day, but in a church we'd never seen, wearing clothes we'd never owned, photos of family gatherings with relatives who looked like us but weren't quite right, faces slightly wrong, expressions that didn't match our memories. The photographs were aged and yellowed, as if they'd been buried for decades. But we'd only been married 3 years, had only lived in this house for 6 months. The timeline made no sense, yet the evidence sat heavy in my hands, smelling of earth and old paper. Sarah refused to look at the photographs directly, but I caught her studying them from the corner of her eye when she thought I wasn't watching. Her face showed the same expression I felt building inside myself: recognition without understanding, familiarity without memory. The breathing earth had stopped returning lost objects and started returning lost lives. I began spending entire nights in the yard, sitting cross-legged beside whichever mound had emerged, breathing in rhythm with the earth's pulse. The holes no longer seemed empty when I lowered my arm into them. I could feel presence, warmth, the suggestion of vast spaces filled with things I almost remembered. Sarah found me there one morning, unconscious in the dirt with soil under my fingernails and my clothes torn as if I'd been digging. She said I'd been missing for 2 days, though I remembered only a single night. The mound beside me held a photograph of myself as a child, standing in our current backyard next to the same oak tree, but wearing clothes from decades before my birth. That was when Sarah packed her bags. She didn't argue or explain or try to convince me to come with her. She simply gathered her essentials while I sat at our kitchen table, staring at impossible photographs and listening to the earth breathe beneath our house. Before leaving, she turned back once to tell me she'd call when she felt safe again. I haven't seen her since, but the earth keeps bringing me pieces of her. A lock of her hair appeared yesterday, braided with flowers I'd never seen her wear. This morning's mound yielded her journal from college, filled with entries describing dreams about a house we hadn't bought yet, and a husband she wouldn't meet for another 6 years. The breathing has become constant now, a steady rhythm that pulses through the floorboards and walls. I sleep when the earth sleeps, wake when it stirs, eat meals that emerge from the soil already prepared and warm. The mounds appear inside the house now, pushing up through the hardwood floors with the same organic persistence they once showed in the yard. I've stopped trying to understand what's happening. Understanding requires distance, objectivity, the ability to step outside a situation and examine it rationally. But I am no longer outside anything. I am part of the breathing earth, part of its patient excavation of buried time. part of its careful curation of memories that may never have belonged to me in the first place. Tonight I will dig deeper than before. The Earth has been preparing something special, something that requires my full participation. I can feel it breathing faster now, excited, anticipating the moment when I finally understand what it's been trying to tell me. The photographs are still scattered across my kitchen table, showing lives I might have lived and choices I might have made. In some of them, Sarah never left. In others, we never met at all. The Earth holds all possibilities, all versions of truth, all the roads that branch and converge in the dark soil beneath our feet. I am going outside now. The Earth is calling my name, speaking in Sarah's voice, promising to show me where all the lost things go before they're ready to return. The cameras are still recording, still documenting the impossible with electronic certainty, but I no longer care what they might capture. Some discoveries are meant to be experienced rather than observed. Some truths can only be learned underground. Story 9. The smell hit me first. Antiseptic mixed with something else. Something organic and unsettling that hospitals never quite managed to scrub away. Grandpa's room sat at the end of a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly under flickering fluorescent lights. And as I approached his door, I could hear it. The soft crackle of static punctuated by distant, unintelligible murmurs. He was sitting upright in his bed when I entered, his weathered hands delicately adjusting the dial of an ancient Zenith radio that definitely hadn't been there during my last visit. The wooden cabinet showed decades of wear, its finish clouded and scratched, and the fabric speaker cover had faded to an indeterminate color, somewhere between brown and gray. Where the hell had he gotten this thing? "Tommy," he said without looking up from the radio, his voice rougher since the surgery. The triple bypass had taken more out of him than the doctors had warned us about. Good timing. I was just getting the frequency right. The static cleared momentarily, and through the speakers came what sounded like a woman's voice, distant and hollow. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency to her tone that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then the static swallowed her voice again, leaving only the persistent electrical whisper that seemed to fill every corner of the sterile room. "Where did you get this?" I pulled the visitor's chair closer to his bed, noting how the radio's glow cast strange shadows across his face. The overhead lights seemed dimmer somehow, as if the old device was drawing power from everything around it. Found it in the storage room down the hall. Amazing what people leave behind. His fingers continued their patient work on the dial, making minute adjustments that brought fleeting moments of clarity to the cacophony. Been keeping me company since yesterday. Better than those awful game shows the nurses put on. I settled back in the chair, watching him work. There was something mesmerizing about the ritual. The way he'd pause when a voice emerged from the static, listening intently before moving the dial again. The voices were always there, just beneath the white noise, fragments of conversations that seemed to materialize and dissolve like smoke. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Through the static, clear as if spoken directly into my ear, came a woman's voice. "He's going to spill the water in 10 seconds. I jerked forward, staring at the radio, certain I'd misheard. But before I could ask Grandpa if he'd caught what she said, his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the plastic water cup on his bedside table. The cup tilted, water splashing across the white sheets and onto the floor with a sound like scattered rain. "Damn it," he muttered, fumbling for the call button. "Hands aren't what they used to be." The radio continued its electronic whisper, but now I was listening, really listening. The voices were speaking English, though they sounded distant, as if coming from another room or perhaps another time. Most of the words were lost in the static, but occasionally a phrase would emerge with startling clarity. "The nurse will come in 3 minutes." I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. The voices in the radio continued their fragmented conversation, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting. At exactly 3:50, Nurse Patricia knocked and entered, her soft-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum as she surveyed the spilled water with practiced resignation. "Let me get you cleaned up, Mr. Hartwell." She moved efficiently around the bed, replacing sheets and mopping the floor while Grandpa apologized repeatedly. The radio's static seemed to grow louder during her presence, as if feeding off the activity in the room. After Patricia left, I stared at the radio with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. "Grandpa, have you noticed anything unusual about that thing?" He paused in his dial adjustment, his rheumy eyes meeting mine with an intensity I hadn't seen since before his surgery. "You heard them too, didn't you?" The admission sent a chill down my spine. I nodded slowly, afraid to voice what we both seemed to be thinking. "Started yesterday afternoon. At first I thought it was just regular radio chatter, CB radio or something. But then..." He trailed off, his fingers unconsciously moving to the surgical scar visible beneath his hospital gown. "They knew things, Tommy, things that hadn't happened yet." Over the next hour, I documented 5 more instances. The voices predicted when the dinner cart would arrive. 6:23 p.m., 2 minutes early according to the usual schedule. When a helicopter would pass overhead, the deep thrum of rotors confirming their prediction. And when the evening shift nurse would forget to replace the water pitcher, she apologized profusely when she realized her oversight. Each prediction proved accurate to the second. As darkness settled outside the hospital windows, the voices seemed to grow stronger, their conversations becoming more frequent and detailed. I could make out multiple speakers now, the woman who seemed to do most of the predicting, an older man with a gravelly voice who occasionally interjected with technical-sounding observations, and what might have been a third person whose words were always too distorted to understand clearly. "Tommy," Grandpa said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Turn it off." "What?" "The radio, turn it off." I reached for the power knob, my hand hesitating as the woman's voice emerged from the static with unusual clarity. "He shouldn't do that. Not yet. He's not ready." But Grandpa's eyes were wide with something that looked like fear, and he nodded urgently toward the radio. I twisted the knob, and the voices died instantly, leaving only the oppressive silence of the hospital room and the distant hum of medical equipment. That's when I heard her. The woman's voice, coming not from the radio, but from somewhere inside my left ear, as clear as if she were whispering directly into my brain. "The lights will flicker in 5 seconds." I counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, and on 5, the fluorescent lights above us stuttered and dimmed before resuming their steady glow. "Jesus Christ," I breathed, my hand instinctively moving to my ear. The voice was gone, but the sensation lingered like the phantom sound of ringing after a loud noise. Grandpa was watching me with an expression of grim understanding. "How long have you been hearing them without the radio?" That was the first time. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant. "How did you know?" "Because it's been happening to me since this morning. The radio just makes them louder, but they're always there now, in my left ear. Always predicting." He touched his chest where the surgical scars lay hidden beneath his gown. "I think they did something to me during the surgery, Tommy. Something they're not telling us about." The woman's voice returned, intimate and invasive. "He's going to ask about the surgery in 30 seconds. I tried to shake the voice away, but it clung to my consciousness like smoke. True to her prediction, Dr. Reeves knocked and entered exactly 30 seconds later, his usual professional smile faltering slightly when he saw our expressions. "How are we feeling tonight, Mr. Hartwell? I wanted to check on your incision and see how you're adjusting." As the doctor performed his examination, the voices provided a running commentary that only I could hear. They predicted each of his movements, each question he would ask, each note he would make on his tablet. The precision was terrifying, as if we were all following a script that had been written in advance. When Dr. Reeves left, I found myself staring at the silent radio with new understanding. "It's not the radio, is it?" Grandpa shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. I think the radio just helped us notice something that was already there." "But what is it? Some kind of side effect from the anesthesia? Brain damage from the surgery?" "Or maybe," he said quietly, "we're picking up something that was always broadcasting. Maybe the surgery just tuned us in. The implications of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. If these voices were real, if they could genuinely predict the future, what did that mean about free will? About choice? Were we simply actors following predetermined paths? Our every decision already scripted and broadcast to anyone with the right frequency? The woman's voice returned, and this time there was something almost sympathetic in her tone. He's starting to understand now. The fear is natural, the questioning, but he needs to know that fighting it only makes the signal stronger. I pressed my palm against my left ear, trying to block out the intrusion, but her words seemed to come from inside my skull. His grandfather will ask him to stay the night in 45 minutes. He'll say yes, even though he doesn't want to. He'll spend the night listening to us, trying to understand, and by morning he'll know that some doors once opened can never be closed again. The accuracy of her previous predictions gave her words a terrible weight. I found myself checking my watch compulsively, dreading the moment when Grandpa would make his request, knowing that I would indeed say yes despite every instinct screaming at me to leave this place and never return. But even as that certainty settled over me like a cold shroud, I couldn't stop listening to the voices. They had become a drug, each confirmed prediction feeding a growing addiction to their impossible knowledge. What would they tell me next? What other futures were they broadcasting from their invisible station? 45 minutes later, Grandpa's request came exactly as predicted. I agreed to stay, my words feeling scripted even as I spoke them. The nurse brought me a cot, and as the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, I lay in the darkness listening to the voices that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. They spoke of small things, which patients would call for assistance during the night shift, when the automated medication dispensers would activate, how many times the security guard would check our corridor. But they also spoke of larger patterns, connections that seemed to stretch beyond the hospital walls, into a vast network of predetermined events. Sometime after midnight, as I drifted between waking and sleeping, the woman's voice returned with a message that would haunt me for the rest of my life. He's beginning to see the pattern now. The surgery was just the first frequency. There are others, Tommy. So many others. And once you start hearing us, really hearing us, you become part of the broadcast too. I sat up in the darkness, my heart pounding. Grandpa was asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful, but the radio on his bedside table seemed to pulse with malevolent life, even in its powered-down state. "What do you mean?" I whispered to the empty room, but the voices had gone quiet, leaving only the antiseptic silence and the growing certainty that I would never leave this frequency behind. Somewhere in the static between stations, between sleeping and waking, between what was and what would be, I had become part of their endless broadcast, and the most terrifying part was that I was no longer sure I wanted to tune out. Story 10. The brass tap handles felt colder than usual under my fingers as I wiped down the bar for the third time that night. Murphy's public house had been quiet since 10, unusually quiet for a Friday. The kind of silence that makes you notice things you normally wouldn't. The electric hum of the beer coolers, the distant rumble of traffic on 9th Street, the way shadows seemed to pool in corners despite the overhead lights blazing at full strength. I'd been tending bar here for 8 years, long enough to know the rhythm of closing time like a practice dance. Chairs stacked, floors mopped, registers counted, taps cleaned. The routine had always been my anchor, especially after rough nights. Tonight felt different, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the absence of our regular Friday crowd, or maybe it was the empty stool at the far end of the bar where Eddie Carmichael used to sit. Eddie had been coming to Murphy's every Friday for the better part of 2 decades, ordering the same thing: Guinness on tap, extra foam, in a chilled glass. He'd nursed that pint for exactly 47 minutes. I'd timed it once out of curiosity, then leave a $5 tip and walk home to his apartment 6 blocks away. Last Friday, he hadn't shown up. Word around the neighborhood was that he'd passed peacefully in his sleep the night before, found by his landlord when the rent was 3 days late. I tried not to think about Eddie as I moved through my closing routine, but his absence felt heavier than presence ever had. The Guinness tap seemed to mock me from its position at the far right of the beer system, its black handle gleaming under the bar lights like an accusatory finger. The first drops appeared at 12:47 a.m. I noticed them while counting the register, tiny dark spots on the white towel I'd spread beneath the taps to catch drips. At first, I assumed it was condensation. The cooler lines ran cold, and moisture buildup was common during humid September nights like this. But when I looked closer, the liquid was too dark, too thick. It moved with the consistency of motor oil, leaving dark stains that didn't absorb into the fabric like water should. A chill ran down my spine as I traced the source. The Guinness tap was weeping black tears. I grabbed a bar rag and wiped the spout clean, expecting to find a loose connection or a problem with the line. The tap felt normal, cool metal, slightly damp from condensation. But as soon as I stepped back, another drop formed at the spout's edge, hanging there like a dark pearl before falling with an audible plop onto the towel below. My hands trembled as I reached for the CO2 valve behind the bar. The pressure system controlled all the taps, shut it off, and nothing could flow. The valve turned easily under my grip, and I heard the familiar hiss of pressure releasing from the lines. I waited, watching the Guinness tap intently. Another drop formed, then another. This wasn't possible. Without pressure, the taps were just empty metal spouts connected to beer kegs in the basement. There was no way liquid could flow without the CO2 system pushing it through the lines. Yet there it was, thick, dark liquid continuing to weep from the Guinness tap like blood from a wound. I grabbed my phone and started to dial Sean Murphy, the owner, but stopped before completing the call. What would I tell him? That the beer tap was crying? That gravity had stopped working in his bar? I'd worked here long enough to know Sean's tolerance for what he called creative explanations for equipment problems. The steady plop, plop, plop of drops hitting the towel filled the silence. Each impact seemed louder than the last, echoing in the empty bar like a metronome counting down to something I couldn't name. I forced myself to focus on logical explanations. Residual pressure in the lines, a faulty valve, temperature differential causing condensation. There had to be a rational cause. I decided to trace the beer line to its source. The basement storage room housed all 6 kegs, connected to the upstairs taps through a network of plastic tubing and pressure regulators. Maybe there was a leak somewhere, or a backup valve I'd forgotten about. The basement stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step echoing in the confined space. The storage room smelled of stale beer and dampness, with undertones of something else, something organic and slightly sweet that made my stomach turn. I flicked on the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows between the steel kegs lined against the far wall. The Guinness keg sat at the end of the row, a tall cylinder of brushed aluminum connected to the others by a web of clear plastic tubing. I followed the line from the keg to where it disappeared through a hole in the ceiling, running up to the tap 20 feet above. Everything looked normal. Proper connections, no visible leaks, pressure gauges reading 0 just as they should with the system shut down. But the keg was vibrating. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible tremors that I felt more than saw. As I placed my hand on the cool metal surface, the vibrations intensified, becoming a steady thrumming that seemed to originate from deep within the container. The sensation reminded me of placing my hand on a washing machine during the spin cycle, except this felt organic, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I jerked my hand away and stumbled backward, knocking over a case of empty bottles. The crash of glass on concrete echoed through the basement like gunshots, and in the sudden silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the unmistakable sound of liquid flowing through the line above my head. Not dripping, flowing. I raced back upstairs, taking the steps 3 at a time. The sight that greeted me at the bar defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. The Guinness tap was running, not dripping, but flowing in a steady stream of thick, black liquid that had the consistency of crude oil. It moved sluggishly, coating the spout, and running down the tap handle in dark rivulets that pooled on the bar surface like spilled ink. The smell hit me next. metallic and organic, with undertones of decay that made my gorge rise. This wasn't beer, not anymore. Whatever was flowing from that tap had transformed into something else entirely, something that belonged in a morgue rather than a bar. I lunged for the tap handle, trying to force it closed, but it was already fully shut. The liquid continued to flow regardless, as if the handle's position was merely a suggestion rather than a mechanical control. Dark foam began to build around the base of the tap, growing like a malignant tumor across the polished surface of the bar. Panic set in as I watched the viscous stream spread, staining everything it touched with oily blackness. I grabbed every towel I could find, trying to contain the flow, but the liquid seemed to repel absorption. It moved with purpose, seeking the edges of the bar and dripping onto the floor in fat, heavy drops that echoed through the empty pub like a percussion section gone mad. That's when I heard Eddie's voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that seemed to originate from inside my own skull. Friday night special. Extra foam. Don't forget the toast. The words were unmistakably Eddie's, the same gravelly tone roughened by 40 years of unfiltered cigarettes, the same slight Boston accent that colored his vowels. But Eddie was gone. Eddie was ash in an urn somewhere, or buried in a plot across town. Eddie couldn't be here, whispering requests for beer that had transformed into this nightmare substance flowing across my bar. You always remembered, the voice continued, and I spun around, searching the empty pub for its source. Friday nights, same stool, same order, same tip. The flow from the tap increased, and I watched in horror as the dark liquid began to foam. But this wasn't the creamy white head that normally crowned a proper Guinness. This foam was black as midnight, expanding rapidly and carrying with it the acrid smell of wet earth and copper pennies. I backed away from the bar, my rational mind struggling to process what I was witnessing. Hallucination, I told myself. Stress-induced psychotic break. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heating system. Anything but the alternative. That somehow, impossibly, Eddie Carmichael was still ordering his Friday night pint. The toast, Eddie's voice whispered again, seeming to come from the growing mass of black foam. You never forget the toast. And I remembered. Eddie never just drank his beer. He always raised the glass first, usually to the memory of his late wife Margaret, sometimes to the Red Sox if they'd won that week, occasionally to another Friday survived. It was part of his ritual, as fixed and predictable as his 47-minute drinking schedule. The foam continued to expand, spilling over the edge of the bar and onto the floor where it pooled in impossible defiance of gravity. It didn't spread randomly like normal liquid. Instead, it moved with intention, flowing toward the stool where Eddie used to sit. The metallic smell intensified, joined now by something sweeter and more disturbing. The cloying scent of flowers left too long in stagnant water. My hands shook as I reached for a clean pint glass from the rack behind me. The logical part of my mind screamed that this was insane, that I was feeding into a delusion that could only worsen with encouragement. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that remembered childhood fears of monsters under the bed, recognized the truth. Something was profoundly wrong here, and whatever it wanted, resistance seemed futile. The glass felt unnaturally heavy as I positioned it under the flowing tap. The dark liquid filled it slowly, coating the sides with an oily film that reflected the overhead lights like crude petroleum. The smell rose from the glass in waves, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. When the glass was full, I lifted it with trembling hands. The liquid inside moved sluggishly, as if it were thicker than it appeared. Dark foam clung to the rim like scum on a pond, and when I looked closely I could swear I saw shapes moving within its depths, shadows that shouldn't exist in something so opaque. To Eddie Carmichael, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of my own thundering heartbeat. The moment the words left my lips, the flow from the tap stopped as abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence was deafening after the constant sound of liquid hitting the bar surface. Even the foam stopped expanding, holding its position like a photograph frozen in time. I stood there for what felt like hours, holding the glass of impossible liquid while my mind tried to process what had just happened. The rational explanations I'd been clinging to crumbled under the weight of evidence. This wasn't equipment failure or stress-induced hallucination. This was something else entirely. Something that responded to words and recognition. Something that demanded acknowledgement of the dead. The glass grew heavier in my hands and I realized I was expected to drink. The thought filled me with revulsion, but Eddie's voice whispered again, closer now, as if he were standing right beside me. Friday night special, same as always. I brought the glass to my lips, the metallic smell overwhelming my senses. The liquid was room temperature, which somehow made it worse, warm like blood, thick like syrup. As it touched my tongue, flavors exploded across my palate, copper and earth, with undertones of something organic and slightly sweet. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, which disturbed me more than if it had been revolting. As I swallowed, warmth spread through my chest and down into my stomach. But it wasn't the comfortable warmth of alcohol. This was something else, something that felt alive and searching. I could feel it moving through my system, exploring, taking inventory. The pub around me began to change. The harsh fluorescent lights dimmed to the warm yellow glow of incandescent bulbs. The silence filled with the ghost of conversation. Dozens of overlapping voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. The air grew thick with the phantom smoke of cigarettes that hadn't been lit in years, and I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly. Eddie's stool was no longer empty. He sat there as he always had, a man in his late 60s with steel-gray hair and calloused hands wrapped around a pint of Guinness. He looked exactly as I remembered him, down to the faded flannel shirt and the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd told me about once. The only difference was his eyes. They held a depth that hadn't been there in life, as if he were seeing far more than the confines of Murphy's public house. Eddie raised his glass in a familiar gesture, and I found myself lifting my own in response. The liquid inside moved slowly, reluctantly, as if it were partially congealed. "Friday night special," Eddie said, his voice carrying the weight of ritual and remembrance. "Same as always." We drank together in the transformed pub, surrounded by the whispered conversations of patrons long gone. The liquid slid down my throat like warm oil, carrying with it the taste of memory and loss. Each swallow brought new flavors, the saltiness of tears, the metallic tang of old blood, the sweet decay of flowers on a grave. When I finished the glass, the warmth in my stomach had spread throughout my entire body. I felt connected to something larger than myself, part of a chain of remembrance that stretched back through every Friday night Eddie had spent in this pub. I could sense his memories as if they were my own. Margaret's laugh, the feeling of her hand in his, the empty apartment that echoed with 40 years of shared conversation. "Time to go," Eddie said, standing from his stool with the same careful movements I remembered from life. "See you next Friday." He walked toward the door with steady steps, his figure becoming less substantial with each footfall until he faded entirely. The transformed pub faded with him, the warm lights returning to harsh fluorescence, the phantom conversations dying away, the smoke clearing to reveal empty air. I stood alone behind the bar, holding an empty glass that now contained nothing more than the residual film of what might have been beer. The Guinness tap was silent and dry, showing no sign of the impossible flow I'd witnessed. The towels I'd used to clean up the spill were damp, but stained only with normal beer residue. My hands shook as I set down the glass and looked around the pub. Everything appeared normal, chairs stacked, floors clean, taps silent. But the taste lingered in my mouth, metallic and warm, and I could still feel that strange warmth moving through my system like a slow-acting drug. I finished my closing routine in a daze, mechanically completing each task while my mind struggled to process what had happened. Was it real? Had I actually served a pint to a dead man? Or had I suffered some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and grief? The evidence supported the latter explanation. There was no sign of the supernatural events I remembered so vividly. But as I locked the door and stepped into the cool September night, I felt a presence watching me from the darkened windows of Murphy's public house. And in my pocket, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Same time next week, don't forget the foam. I deleted the message without reading it twice, but the words had already burned themselves into my memory. Next Friday felt simultaneously far away and terrifyingly close. Part of me wanted to find another job, to never step foot in Murphy's again. But a larger part, the part that tasted copper and warmth when I swallowed, knew I'd be back. Some rituals once begun demand completion. Some debts, once acknowledged, require payment. And some Friday nights, the dead still need their beer served with extra foam and a toast to memory. The walk home took longer than usual, partly because I kept looking over my shoulder, and partly because I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to reach my apartment. The taste in my mouth was changing, becoming more complex with each passing minute. Underneath the metallic warmth, new flavors emerged, the yeast and hops of proper beer, the satisfaction of a drink shared with a friend, the bittersweetness of traditions that outlive those who created them. By the time I reached my front door, I understood that what I'd experienced wasn't entirely supernatural, or entirely psychological. It existed somewhere in the space between, in the realm where memory and reality blur into something larger than either. Eddie Carmichael was gone, but his Friday nights lived on, sustained by the simple act of remembrance and the ritualistic pouring of beer. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, knowing that next Friday would bring me back to Murphy's, back to the brass taps and the familiar routine of closing time. And when 12:47 a.m. arrived, I'd be ready with a clean glass and the words Eddie needed to hear. A toast to memory, an acknowledgement of presence, a bridge between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. The warm sensation in my stomach pulsed once, like a heartbeat, then settled into a steady rhythm that matched my own. I was no longer just the bartender at Murphy's public house. I was the keeper of Friday night traditions, the guardian of rituals that transcended death. And somewhere in the darkness behind me, I could swear I heard the distant sound of a beer tap opening, ready to serve one more round to those who still remembered how to ask. Story 11. The cold woke me, not the gentle chill that creeps through old windows or seeps up from basement stones, but something more deliberate. A precise absence of warmth that felt almost surgical in its application. I surfaced from sleep with that peculiar disorientation that comes from waking somewhere unfamiliar, my body registering the wrongness before my mind could process it. The Alderton mansion had been in my family for 3 generations, though none of us had lived here since my great-uncle's death in 1987. The inheritance lawyers had been surprisingly efficient, and within 6 months of Uncle Horace's funeral, I found myself the reluctant owner of a 19th century monument to architectural excess. Moving here seemed logical enough. My lease in the city was ending, my freelance writing career allowed for location independence, and the mansion came with Mrs. Holloway, a live-in housekeeper who'd maintained the property through decades of abandonment. But logic felt thin and inadequate now, in the pre-dawn darkness of my first night, as I reached instinctively for covers that weren't there. My comforter lay at the foot of the bed, folded with impossible precision. Not bunched or kicked off in sleep, but arranged in perfect triangular pleats that caught what little moonlight filtered through the heavy curtains. The fabric formed an intricate fan pattern, each fold crisp and deliberate, like the work of someone with infinite patience and mathematical precision. I sat up slowly, my breath visible in small puffs. The heating system must have failed. That would explain both the cold and my subconscious decision to remove the covers. Except I had no memory of folding anything, and the geometric perfection of the arrangement seemed far beyond what I could accomplish even fully awake, let alone in the throes of disturbed sleep. The floorboards creaked as I stood, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should in the cavernous bedroom. I pulled the comforter back over the mattress, noting how it wanted to hold its creased shape, fighting against being unfolded. The fabric felt slightly damp, as if it had been exposed to morning dew, though we were on the second floor and the windows remained firmly closed. I managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep before dawn leaked gray through the curtains. Mrs. Holloway was already in the kitchen when I descended, her silver hair pinned back with the same precision I'd observed in everything about the house. She moved with the economy of someone who'd spent years learning the mansion's rhythms, her footsteps somehow finding the spots between creaks, her hands knowing exactly where each implement belonged. The incident with the comforter felt almost absurd in the morning light, but something about her knowing look suggested she was waiting for me to mention it. I described what I'd found, watching her face for any sign of surprise or concern. Instead, she nodded with the calm acceptance of someone hearing familiar news. She suggested I might have been sleeping too warmly for the house's liking. The mansion, she explained, had its own way of maintaining comfort levels. The previous residents had learned not to fight these adjustments. The house knew best about temperature regulation, having housed generations of people who no longer required warmth themselves. Her phrasing struck me as odd, but before I could ask for clarification, she'd moved on to discussing groceries and meal schedules with the same matter-of-fact tone. The second night, I deliberately used only a light sheet. I woke to find it folded into a complex rosette pattern on the dresser across the room, a design so intricate it seemed to require tools and considerable time. The sheet had somehow traveled 15 feet from the bed without waking me, despite my typically light sleep. The room felt several degrees colder than the previous night, and my skin had that peculiar tightness that comes from prolonged exposure to chill. More disturbing was the faint scent lingering in the air, something like lavender mixed with old paper, as if someone had been reading antique books nearby while I slept. By the third night, I'd developed a strategy. I would use minimal covers but stay alert, listening for any disturbance. I positioned myself so I could see both the door and the windows, and kept a small flashlight within easy reach. Sleep came despite my vigilance, and I woke to find my pillowcases removed and arranged in an elaborate spiral on the floor beside the bed. The bare pillows felt cold against my cheek, and I realized I'd been lying on them for hours without covers in a room that couldn't have been warmer than 50 degrees. But what unnerved me most was discovering the bedroom door slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it, yet now it stood open just enough to allow passage for someone moving carefully in the dark. Mrs. Holloway's reaction to my growing concern remained unsatisfyingly calm. She spoke about the house's consideration for my comfort, how it was simply trying to prevent me from overheating. When I pressed her about the moved bedding, she suggested that perhaps I was a more active sleeper than I realized. The house, she insisted, was only responding to my apparent discomfort with excessive warmth. Her explanations might have been reassuring if not for the way she avoided meeting my eyes when she spoke, and the fact that I'd begun noticing other small changes throughout the mansion. Books I'd left open would be found closed the next morning, bookmarks placed at different pages, always further ahead, as if someone had been reading after me. Chairs would be positioned differently in rooms I rarely used, turned to face corners or walls instead of the natural focal points of windows or fireplaces. Once I discovered all the curtains on the first floor had been adjusted to precise heights, creating a pattern of light and shadow that transformed familiar spaces into something subtly wrong. The house felt increasingly like a living thing, breathing around me in ways that had nothing to do with settling timber or thermal expansion. Sounds seemed to migrate. A creak starting in one room would finish in another, as if the building itself was slowly shifting position. The heating system would cycle on at irregular intervals, regardless of the thermostat settings, filling the halls with whispers of moving air that carried no actual warmth. I began leaving small indicators to test my sanity. Coins placed at specific angles, pens positioned precisely on desk edges, doors open to measured degrees. Each morning brought subtle alterations that could be explained by forgetfulness or imagination, yet accumulating evidence suggested something far more deliberate. The fourth night, I decided to stay awake. I arranged myself in the bedroom's wing chair, facing the bed, wrapped in a heavy bathrobe I'd brought from my apartment. The mansion settled around me with its catalog of familiar sounds, pipes ticking, wood adjusting, the distant whisper of wind through architectural gaps. Normal sounds that should have been comforting but now seemed like coded messages I couldn't quite interpret. Around 2 a.m., The temperature began dropping noticeably. My breath started misting, and the windows developed a thin film of condensation despite the dry autumn air outside. The cold felt directed somehow, not the general chill of a heating failure, but something more focused, as if the room itself was exhaling frost. I watched my covers, a single lightweight blanket draped over the empty bed, for any sign of movement. Nothing visible occurred, yet when I blinked, the fabric seemed to be settling differently, as if recently disturbed by hands I couldn't see. The feeling of being observed grew stronger as the night progressed. Not the casual awareness of another presence, but the intense scrutiny of something studying me with scientific interest. I found myself tensing at sounds that hadn't registered moments before, a soft rustling like fabric being handled, barely audible footsteps on carpet, the whisper of air movement that suggested someone passing nearby. Around 4 a.m., exhaustion finally claimed me in the chair. I woke at dawn to find the blanket gone from the bed entirely. A systematic search of the room revealed it folded into an impossible geometric sculpture on the bathroom vanity, a construction so complex it seemed to defy the properties of fabric itself. The material had been twisted and pleated into a three-dimensional mandala that cast intricate shadows in the morning light. But what shattered my remaining rationality was the discovery of my bathrobe, removed while I slept in the chair and arranged in a perfect spiral on the floor around my feet, as if something had undressed me with infinite care while I remained unconscious. Mrs. Holloway found me in the kitchen an hour later, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring at my coffee with the hollow focus of someone questioning fundamental assumptions about reality. She asked about my night with the same gentle concern she might show for a guest recovering from a minor illness. When I described waking in the chair without my robe, she nodded sympathetically and mentioned that the house sometimes helped with temperature regulation while people slept, regardless of where they chose to rest. Her casual acceptance of the impossible made everything worse. Either I was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown, or Mrs. Holloway had knowledge about this house that she was choosing not to share. Both possibilities felt equally terrifying. I demanded explanations. What exactly did she mean by the house regulating temperature? Who or what was moving my belongings? Why did she seem so unsurprised by events that defied basic logic? She paused in her coffee preparation, her back to me, and spoke quietly about the house's long history of hospitality. Many residents had lived here over the decades, she said, and some had grown so comfortable they'd chosen never to leave. They remained considerate hosts, she assured me, always concerned with their guests' comfort, though their understanding of physical needs had become somewhat modified over time. The implication hit me with crystalline clarity. She was suggesting the mansion was occupied by former residents who died here but remained in some form, continuing their caretaking duties with the dedication of people who no longer required sleep, warmth, or other living comforts. I asked directly if she believed the house was haunted. She considered the question seriously before responding. That haunted suggested something unpleasant or malevolent. The presences here, she insisted, were simply persistent in their helpfulness. That afternoon, I researched the mansion's history at the local library. Public records revealed a pattern that should have been impossible to miss during the inheritance process. Dozens of people had died in the house over its 150-year history, not from violence or tragedy, but from the gradual accumulation of natural deaths that occur when a building serves as home to multiple generations. Uncle Horace had been the last, found peacefully in his sleep in the same bedroom I now occupied. Before him, his sister Margaret in 1983, their parents in the late 1960s, various aunts, uncles, and elderly cousins stretching back to the mansion's original construction. The house seemed to collect family members the way some buildings collect dust. Slowly, naturally, inevitably. Mrs. Holloway herself had been employed there for 47 years, arriving as a young woman shortly after her husband's death. The record showed no evidence of her ever leaving the property for extended periods, no other addresses or employment. For nearly half a century, the mansion had been her entire world. That night, I made a decision that felt like the only rational response to an impossible situation. I would leave in the morning. I packed methodically, trying to convince myself that departure was the obvious solution. Whatever was happening in the mansion, whether supernatural manipulation or psychological breakdown, distance would provide clarity. I could return the house to Mrs. Holloway's care and resume my life somewhere with reliable heating and bedding that stayed where I left it. Yet as I folded clothes into my suitcase, I found myself creating the same precise geometric patterns I'd been finding with my bedding. My hands seemed to know how to make crisp, mathematical pleats without conscious instruction, as if the technique was spreading from the mansion's influence into my own movements. The realization that I might be losing myself to whatever lived in this house filled me with the first genuine terror I'd experienced since arriving. I went to bed fully clothed, my packed bags beside the door, car keys clutched in my hand. If I woke to find myself undressed and my belongings rearranged, I would know with certainty that something beyond my control was affecting my mind and body. Sleep came surprisingly easily, perhaps aided by the relief of having made a decision. I woke at dawn, still dressed, keys still in my hand. My bags remained where I'd left them, untouched and ready for departure. For the first time in days, my bedding hadn't been disturbed. The room felt warmer too, almost welcoming in the morning light. Perhaps whatever presence Mrs. Holloway believed inhabited the mansion had accepted my decision to leave and was allowing me to go gracefully. I should have felt relieved. Instead, as I loaded my bags into the car and prepared to drive away from the mansion forever, I found myself consumed by an unexpected emotion: profound loneliness. The house looked smaller in my rearview mirror, almost abandoned despite Mrs. Holloway's continued presence. I realized I was leaving the first place in years where something had shown genuine concern for my comfort, even if that concern came from a source I couldn't understand or accept. The rational part of my mind insisted I was making the right choice, escaping before whatever was happening could progress further. But another part, a part that had learned to appreciate precise geometric folds and carefully regulated temperatures, whispered that I was abandoning the most attentive hosts I'd ever encountered. As I drove through the mansion's gates for what I intended to be the last time, I caught myself adjusting my jacket with the same mathematical precision I'd been finding in my bedding. Later, in my new apartment across town, I would wake on cold nights to find myself folding and refolding my covers into increasingly complex patterns, my hands moving with a skill I didn't remember acquiring. The drafty rental never felt quite warm enough, and I began to miss the mansion's consideration for proper temperature regulation. Mrs. Holloway had been right about one thing: the house had known best about comfort levels. And sometimes, late at night when my new place felt particularly empty and poorly heated, I wondered if my hosts in the mansion were still waiting, ready to resume their careful attention to my needs, should I ever choose to return home. Story 12. The antique shop smelled of mothballs and forgotten memories when I first spotted it. A pale green baby monitor from the early 80s, its plastic housing yellowed with age, but its speakers pristine. Perfect for my retro setup, I thought, imagining how its vintage aesthetic would complement the mid-century furniture in my studio apartment. The elderly shopkeeper wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he counted my $20 bills. "Works perfectly," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. Well, you'll see." I should have asked what he meant. For the first week, the monitor served its purpose beautifully. Connected to my phone via a simple auxiliary cable I'd soldered myself, it filled my workspace with the warm, slightly tinny sound that only analog speakers could produce. The chunky volume dial and frequency tuner gave it an authentic charm that my sleek modern speakers lacked. My clients loved the retro vibe during video calls, and I felt satisfied with my find. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night. I'd been working late on a logo design, the apartment dark except for the blue glow of my monitor and the soft amber light from my desk lamp. Around 2 a.m., fatigue finally overtook me, and I saved my work, disconnected my phone, and headed to bed. The baby monitor sat silent on my desk, its power light a steady red dot in the darkness. I was nearly asleep when I heard it, a faint crackling static, like an old radio searching for a station. My eyes opened in the darkness, and I listened. The static grew clearer, more defined, and then underneath it, something else. Something that made my skin prickle. Soft sobbing. Not the harsh wails of an infant, but the gentle rhythmic crying of someone trying to stay quiet. Someone trying not to be heard. The sound was so clear, so present, that I sat up immediately and looked toward my desk. The monitor's power light glowed red, unchanged, but somehow the device was receiving something. I climbed out of bed and approached it slowly, bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The crying continued, occasionally interrupted by small hiccups and sniffles. As I got closer, I could make out more details, the slight echo that suggested a small room, the muffled quality that indicated the source was at some distance from a microphone. I reached for the power button, but hesitated. There was something about the crying that felt wrong, not quite human. The rhythm was too perfect, too measured, as if it were a recording played on loop. But underneath that mechanical quality there was something else, a desperation that seemed genuine, raw. When I finally pressed the power button, the crying stopped instantly, cut off mid-sob. The silence that followed felt oppressive, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I unplugged the device completely and returned to bed, but sleep eluded me for hours. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, or perhaps interference from a nearby apartment building. Old electronics were notorious for picking up stray signals. I'd heard stories of baby monitors receiving transmissions from houses blocks away, or even radio stations from distant cities under the right atmospheric conditions. But when I examined the monitor in daylight, something troubled me. The device was completely self-contained. No antenna. No obvious way for it to receive external signals when disconnected from any input source. The auxiliary cable had been unplugged. There was no wireless capability built into the vintage unit. Yet somehow, it had been receiving something. I spent the day researching the model online, finding scattered references in electronics forums and vintage audio communities. Most posts were routine, people asking about replacement parts or sharing restoration tips. But buried in one thread, I found a comment that made me pause. Weird thing about these old Kidco monitors, they sometimes pick up signals they shouldn't. Had one years ago that would randomly broadcast conversations from God knows where. Figured it was crossed wires or something, but when I opened it up, couldn't find any explanation. Sold it to a thrift store eventually. Thing gave me the creeps. I stared at the comment for a long time, my coffee growing cold beside me. The username was GarageDad78, and when I clicked on his profile, I found it had been inactive for 3 years. No way to contact him. No follow-up posts explaining what he'd experienced. That evening, I deliberately left the monitor unplugged and powered down, but I found myself glancing at it repeatedly as I worked. The device sat there innocuously, its retro charm suddenly feeling more ominous than appealing. Around midnight, I noticed the room had grown unusually quiet. No traffic noise from the street below, no sounds from neighboring apartments. Even the usual hum of my computer seemed muted. The static began again at 12:47 a.m. This time, I was ready. I had my phone out, recording app open, prepared to document whatever I heard. The crackling grew stronger, more focused, and then the crying began again. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, there were words. Soft humming first, a lullaby I didn't recognize. The melody was simple, repetitive, but sung with a voice that seemed to waver between different tones, as if the singer couldn't quite decide on the right pitch. The humming continued for several minutes, occasionally broken by those same quiet sobs, and then words began to emerge. Sleep now, sleep tight, don't let the shadows bite. The voice was neither distinctly male nor female, but something in between, filtered through layers of static and distance. The words were clear enough to understand, but there was something wrong with the pronunciation, as if the speaker's mouth weren't quite the right shape for human speech. Rock-a-bye, baby, in the treetop, when the wind blows, your cradle will. The song stopped abruptly, replaced by a long silence that somehow felt expectant. I realized I was holding my breath, my finger frozen over the record button on my phone. The silence stretched on, And just as I was beginning to think it was over, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across what sounded like a wooden floor. They grew louder, closer, as if someone were approaching the microphone, or whatever was transmitting the signal. My heart began to race as the footsteps stopped, and in the sudden quiet, I could swear I heard breathing. Slow, measured breathing, just slightly too fast to be natural. Then, impossibly, a whisper that seemed to come not from the monitor's speakers, but from directly behind my ear. "I can see you listening." I spun around so fast I knocked my water glass off the desk. It shattered on the floor, sending fragments skittering across the hardwood, but there was nothing behind me, nothing at all. When I turned back to the monitor, it was silent again, its red power light unwavering. My hands shaking, I unplugged the device and carried it to my closet, burying it under a pile of old clothes. I spent the rest of the night with every light in the apartment on, jumping at every small sound, my mind racing with explanations that all felt inadequate. Sleep, when it finally came near dawn, brought dreams of static and whispered lullabies. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and mounting paranoia. I'd removed the monitor from my apartment entirely, taking it to my office downtown and locking it in a storage closet. But the experience had left me changed, hypersensitive to every small sound, every shadow that moved in my peripheral vision. I found myself researching the history of baby monitors, diving deep into technical specifications and patent filings, looking for any explanation for what I'd experienced. The science was straightforward: analog radio transmissions on specific frequencies, designed to carry audio from one unit to another within a limited range. Nothing that could explain disembodied voices, impossible receptions, or whispers that seemed to bypass the speakers entirely. But the more I read, the more I discovered scattered accounts of similar experiences. Forum posts, Reddit threads, even a few academic papers about electronic voice phenomena and unexplained radio transmissions. The stories were remarkably consistent. Old electronics, particularly baby monitors and vintage radios, occasionally receiving signals that couldn't be explained by conventional radio theory. One academic paper, published in a journal of paranormal research that most scientists wouldn't take seriously, proposed a theory that made my skin crawl. The author suggested that certain electronic devices, particularly those designed to monitor or listen, might sometimes function as accidental conduits for— the paper used clinical language, but the implication was clear: communications from somewhere else. I told myself it was nonsense, pseudoscience dressed up in academic language. But late at night, alone in my apartment, the theory felt less ridiculous and more terrifying. A week after I'd locked the monitor away, I found myself standing outside my office building at 2 a.m., keycard in hand, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The lobby was empty, security cameras tracking my movement as I made my way to the elevator. The building felt different at night, larger, more maze-like, full of shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. My office was on the 7th floor, and the elevator's hum seemed unusually loud in the silence. When the doors opened, I hesitated, suddenly aware of how isolated I was, how many floors stretched above and below me. But the compulsion was stronger than my fear, and I walked down the darkened hallway to my office door. The storage closet was exactly as I'd left it, the monitor buried under old marketing materials and forgotten client files. But as I lifted the device out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The power cord was plugged into the wall outlet, something I definitely hadn't done when I'd stored it. The red power light was on, and as I stood there holding it, staring at that steady red glow, the static began again. Clearer this time, more focused, as if the signal were stronger in this place. At this hour, the familiar crackling filled the air, and underneath it, that voice I'd come to dread. But tonight, the voice wasn't singing lullabies or whispering threats. Tonight, it was calling my name. Over and over, in that same pitch-shifted, wrong-sounding tone, my name echoed from the speakers. But more disturbing than hearing my name was the realization that I'd never told anyone about the monitor. I'd researched it online, yes, but always anonymously, never using accounts tied to my real identity. There was no way for whatever was transmitting to know who I was, unless it could see me. The thought hit me like a physical blow, and I dropped the monitor. It clattered to the floor but continued broadcasting, my name now mixed with something that might have been laughter. I backed away from the device, my heart hammering against my ribs, and that's when I noticed something else. In the darkened window of my office, barely visible in the reflection of the city lights outside, I could see a shape, tall, thin, standing just behind my shoulder. When I spun around, there was nothing there. But in the window's reflection, the shape remained, seeming to watch me with eyes I couldn't quite make out. I ran. I left the monitor on the floor of my office and ran through the empty hallways, my footsteps echoing off the walls like gunshots. The elevator seemed to take forever, and when it finally arrived, I jabbed the lobby button repeatedly, willing the doors to close faster. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing on the sidewalk in the cold night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, 7 floors up, I could see the dim glow of my office window, and in that glow, I could swear I saw movement, a shadow passing back and forth, as if someone were pacing inside. I never went back to that office. I called in sick the next day, then the day after that, and eventually, I simply stopped returning calls from my employer. They probably think I had some kind of breakdown, and maybe they're right. Maybe none of this is real. Maybe the stress of freelance work and city living finally caught up with me, and my mind invented elaborate hallucinations to cope with the pressure. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw in that window's reflection. And sometimes late at night in my new apartment across town, I still hear it. Faint and distant, as if coming from very far away, I hear that static-filled voice calling my name. I've thrown away every electronic device that could conceivably receive radio signals. I've moved 3 times in the past month. I've seen doctors and therapists and anyone else who might be able to explain what's happening to me. None of them believe me, of course. They prescribe medication and suggest stress management techniques, and recommend that I take a vacation somewhere quiet and restful. They use words like auditory hallucinations and paranoid ideation, and sleep deprivation psychosis. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm losing my mind, and the voice exists only in my head. But if that's true, then how do you explain the call I received this morning? Unknown number, no caller ID, nothing but static when I answered. And underneath that static, so faint I might have imagined it, the sound of someone humming a lullaby. The same lullaby I first heard through that vintage baby monitor. The one I swear I left behind in that office building I'll never enter again. The humming stopped when I hung up the phone, but the silence that followed felt wrong, expectant, as if something were waiting for me to pick up again. As if something were trying very hard to reach me, and growing frustrated with my refusal to listen. I keep telling myself it's not real, that voices can't travel through unpowered electronics, that shadows can't watch you from window reflections, that whatever happened in that office was just a stress-induced breakdown with auditory and visual components. But late at night, when the city grows quiet and the darkness presses against my windows, I find myself listening for that familiar static. And despite everything, despite the fear, despite the sleepless nights, despite the growing certainty that my sanity is slipping away piece by piece, part of me wants to hear it again. Part of me wants to know what it's trying to tell me. And that, more than anything else, is what terrifies me most of all. Story 13. The mountain road stretched ahead like a serpent's spine, its asphalt surface gleaming wet under my headlights. I should have taken the interstate, but something about the familiar curves of Highway 49 had called to me that evening. Maybe it was nostalgia, or maybe it was the same restless energy that had been eating at me for weeks, the kind that made sleep impossible and solitude unbearable. The fog had been building for the last 10 miles, creeping down from the peaks like fingers reaching for the valley below. What started as wisps dancing across my windshield had thickened into something more substantial, more alive. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel as I reduced my speed to 30, then 25. The yellow lines had become suggestions rather than certainties. That's when I saw it. The rock materialized from the gray curtain ahead, sitting perfectly centered in my lane as if someone had placed it there with deliberate precision. Basketball-sized, dark granite streaked with quartz veins that caught my headlights like frozen lightning. I hit the brakes harder than I should have, feeling the sedan's weight shift forward as the anti-lock system chattered beneath my feet. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no distant traffic, no night sounds that should have filled a mountain evening. Just the tick of cooling metal and my own breathing, suddenly loud in the confined space of the car. I sat there for a full minute, studying the stone. It was real, had to be real. Road debris was common enough on these mountain passes, rocks tumbling from unstable slopes after winter storms. But something about its placement bothered me. Too perfect, too centered, as if it had been waiting. The practical part of my mind won out. I switched on my hazard lights and stepped into the fog. The air was thick and cold, carrying scents of pine and something else, something organic and earthy that I couldn't place. My footsteps seemed muffled, as if the fog itself were absorbing sound. The rock was heavier than it looked, rough against my palms, warm despite the cool night air. I hefted it to the shoulder of the road, well clear of the travel lane. That's when I heard them. Voices, distant and thin, carried on air that had no breeze. Children's voices, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, but their tone was unmistakable. Gratitude. The sound raised goosebumps along my arms and sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I looked around, peering into the gray nothing that surrounded me. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed, except me. The voices faded as quickly as they had come, leaving me wondering if I had heard them at all. Back in the car, I shook my head and tried to laugh at myself. Stress, fatigue, the kind of auditory hallucination that comes from too many sleepless nights and too much coffee. The explanation felt thin, but I clung to it as I put the car in drive and continued up the mountain. The fog began to thin after another mile, and I allowed myself to believe the worst was behind me. The road ahead cleared, revealing familiar landmarks. The old logging bridge, the scenic overlook where teenagers parked on Friday nights. Normal things, real things. But 20 minutes later, it happened again. The fog rolled in like a living thing, thick and purposeful, reducing visibility to mere feet. And there, impossibly, was another rock. Same size, same placement, same perfect positioning in the center of my lane. My heart hammered against my ribs as I brought the car to a stop. This time I didn't get out immediately. I sat with the engine running, wipers sweeping across the windshield in a futile attempt to clear the impossible density of the fog. The rock sat there, patient and immovable, as if it had been waiting for me to return. When I finally forced myself out of the car, my hands shook as I lifted the stone. Again, that strange warmth against my palms. Again, those whispered voices drifting from the gray void around me, soft and grateful and impossible. This time, I thought I caught a fragment of actual words, something that sounded like, "Thank you, mister." I dropped the rock as if it had burned me. It hit the asphalt with a sound like breaking teeth, and the voices stopped. The fog seemed to recoil, pulling back just enough for me to see a few yards in each direction. Empty road, empty forest. No signs of life anywhere except my own ragged breathing and the tremor in my hands. I kicked the rock to the shoulder with my foot this time, unwilling to touch it again with bare skin. The moment it left the road surface, the fog began to dissipate, rolling away as if someone had turned off a switch. Within minutes, the night was clear again, stars visible overhead and the road ahead stretching normal and familiar into the distance. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I drove the rest of the way to the summit in a state of hypervigilance, checking my mirrors constantly, jumping at every shadow that moved in my peripheral vision. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Stress-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation, maybe the early stages of some neurological condition I should get checked out. But the deeper, more primitive part of my brain, The part that had kept my ancestors alive in dark forests full of things that went bump in the night, was screaming warnings I couldn't ignore. At the top of the pass, I pulled into the parking area of an abandoned rest stop and called my wife. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, and I realized I didn't know what I would have said anyway. How do you explain that rocks are following you? That children's voices are thanking you from empty fog? That something fundamental about the world feels wrong? I didn't leave a message. Instead, I sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the heater on, trying to convince myself to turn around and go home. Take the interstate like a normal person. Get some sleep. See a doctor in the morning. But I had to know. The descent down the far side of the mountain began normally enough. Clear skies, good visibility, the kind of driving that should have been relaxing after the stress of the climb. I found myself checking the road ahead obsessively, looking for any sign of fog, any hint of stones that shouldn't be there. It wasn't until I reached the steepest section of the descent that I saw the fog bank waiting for me below, stretched across the road like a gray wall. My stomach dropped as I realized I had a choice: stop here and turn around, or drive into whatever was waiting for me in that unnatural mist. I chose to stop. The moment my brake lights came on, the fog began to move. It flowed uphill toward me like water running backward, defying gravity and common sense in equal measure. I threw the car into reverse, but the fog was faster, engulfing my car in seconds and turning the world into a gray nothing that pressed against the windows like living things. The engine sputtered and died. In the sudden silence, I could hear them more clearly than ever before. Children's voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in words I couldn't understand but didn't need to. They were grateful. They were waiting. They wanted something from me, something I had given them before without realizing. And then, through the windshield, I saw the stone. It was larger this time, impossibly large, the size of a compact car and perfectly spherical. It sat in the road ahead of me like a boulder that had rolled down from some impossible height, blocking the entire width of the pavement. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. It was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, rolling toward my car with deliberate purpose. I tried to start the engine. The starter cranked but wouldn't catch, as if something were preventing combustion itself. The stone continued its approach, and I could see now that it wasn't just rolling, it was floating, suspended inches above the asphalt, moving with the fluid grace of something swimming through water rather than air. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I began to make out individual words in the chorus. "Thank you," they said. "Thank you for moving us. Thank you for helping. Thank you for being kind." But underneath the gratitude was something else, something hungry. The stone was 20 feet away now and still approaching. I could see details in its surface that shouldn't have been visible in the fog. Faces, dozens of them, pressed against the granite from the inside like children looking through frosted glass. Their mouths moved in synchronization with the voices I was hearing, and their eyes, oh God, their eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I abandoned the car. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own feet as I stumbled away from the road, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches in my desperation to get away from whatever that thing was. The voices followed me, growing fainter but never disappearing entirely, calling my name now in chorus. "Thank you, David. Thank you for being so helpful. Thank you for being so kind." I never told them my name. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then crawled until I found a tree large enough to hide behind. The fog was everywhere, but it seemed thinner here, and I could make out shapes. Other trees, a creek bed, the normal geography of a mountain forest. I pulled out my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen showed no bars, no carrier name, just the time, 3:33 a.m. I waited there until dawn, listening to the voices fade as the fog gradually dissipated with the rising sun. When I finally worked up the courage to return to the road, I found my car exactly where I'd left it, engine running normally. No sign of any stone anywhere. The road was clear, the asphalt unmarked, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. I drove home in silence, trying to convince myself it had been a dream, a stress-induced breakdown, anything but reality. When I got back to town, I went straight to the library and started researching. Local history, geological surveys, anything that might explain what I had experienced. What I found made my blood run cold. Highway 49 had been built in the 1960s, cutting through what had once been the town of Millfield. The town had been abandoned in the 1950s after a series of mine collapses that had killed 37 people. Most of the bodies were never recovered. Among the missing were 16 children from the local school, lost when their bus was caught in a landslide that buried them under tons of rock and debris. The accident happened on a foggy night in November, on what is now the steepest section of Highway 49, the part of the road where I had stopped. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence. Historical tragedy doesn't create supernatural phenomena. Dead children don't manipulate stones and fog to help passing motorists. These things don't happen in the real world. But every night since then, I dream of children's voices thanking me for my kindness. And sometimes, when I'm driving on foggy nights, I find myself looking for rocks in the road, waiting for the chance to be helpful again. Because part of me wonders what would have happened if I had ignored that first stone. What would have happened if I had just driven around it and kept going? And another part of me, the part that still hears those voices in quiet moments, wonders if I would have made it home at all. The fog is rolling in tonight, and I can hear them calling from outside my window. They're thanking me again, their voices soft and grateful and impossible. I think they want me to come back to the mountain. I think I'm going to go. Story 14. A camera's flash erupted across the marsh like artificial lightning, freezing the moment in stark white brilliance before darkness reclaimed the wetlands. I lowered my Nikon, squinting through the viewfinder's green glow as the autofocus struggled against the murky night. 3 weeks into my field research documenting nocturnal wildlife patterns in the Blackwater Preserve, and I'd captured nothing more remarkable than a few startled herons and the occasional muskrat. The humid August air clung to my skin like wet fabric, and the symphony of cricket chirps and bullfrog croaks created a dense wall of sound that seemed to press against my eardrums. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a haunting note that echoed across the water before dissolving into silence. I checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. Time to head back to the research station. As I packed my equipment, the memory card's tiny LED blinked, indicating successful image capture. I'd review the shots later, back in the climate-controlled comfort of my temporary lab. The marsh had a way of playing tricks on perception after dark, shadows that moved independently of their sources, reflections that didn't quite match their origins. More than once I'd photographed what I thought was wildlife, only to discover I'd captured nothing but reeds and moonlight. The drive back to the station took 20 minutes along winding dirt roads that carved through cypress groves and abandoned farmland. My headlights swept across weathered fence posts and overgrown ditches, occasionally catching the reflective eyes of deer that watched from the tree line with unsettling intensity. The radio crackled with distant stations, voices fading in and out like ghosts, trying to communicate across vast distances. Inside the research station, a converted ranger cabin that the university had equipped with basic laboratory facilities, I downloaded the night's photographs onto my laptop. The screen's blue glow seemed unnaturally bright after hours in the darkness, and I rubbed my eyes as the images populated the folder. Most were exactly what I'd expected. Empty marsh, reeds swaying in invisible breezes, water reflecting fragments of moonlight. But the final photograph stopped me cold. There, rising from the muddy bank between two stands of cattails, stood a figure. Not a person, something that might once have been a person. The shape was humanoid, but wrong, as if sculpted from the marsh itself. Mud clung to what appeared to be the remnants of a military uniform, though the details were obscured by layers of sediment and decay. A tricorn hat sat askew on a head that seemed more suggestion than substance, and one arm was raised as if in salute or warning. I leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the brightness and contrast. The figure's face, if it could be called a face, was a hollow suggestion of features carved from wet earth. Empty sockets where eyes should have been, a mouth that appeared to be either screaming or laughing. The image quality was crisp, the focus perfect. This wasn't a trick of shadows or a photographic artifact. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my field notebook, flipping to that evening's entries. I'd photographed that exact spot at 11:43 p.m., drawn by what I'd thought was unusual movement among the reeds. In my notes, I'd recorded the location's GPS coordinates and atmospheric conditions, but nothing about seeing anything unusual through the viewfinder. I studied the photograph again, zooming in until the pixels became visible. The mud soldier, for that's what my mind had already begun calling it, stood approximately 40 feet from my position, based on the known height of the surrounding cattails. The detail was extraordinary. I could make out what appeared to be buttons on the uniform, the suggestion of a musket clutched in one muddy hand, even what might have been military insignia, though they were too degraded to identify clearly. Sleep came reluctantly that night, interrupted by dreams of standing water and half-formed shapes that moved just beyond the edge of vision. I woke twice to check the locks on the station's doors, though I couldn't explain why I felt the need for such precautions. The photograph remained on my laptop screen, the mud soldier frozen in his eternal salute. The next morning brought practical concerns. I needed to document my finding properly, which meant printing physical copies for my research file. The station's printer was an aging inkjet model that wheezed and complained, but eventually produced a high-quality 8x10 print of the mysterious figure. I held the photograph up to the morning light streaming through the station's windows, examining every detail. The image was even more unsettling in physical form. The mud soldier seemed to possess a weight and presence that the digital version had only hinted at. His position among the cattails appeared natural, as if he'd been standing there for decades, slowly accumulating layers of sediment and organic matter. That afternoon, I returned to the exact location where I'd captured the image. The GPS coordinates led me to a section of the marsh that looked utterly mundane in daylight. A small inlet surrounded by common cattails and water lilies, with muddy banks that showed no unusual formations or disturbances. I spent 2 hours searching for any sign of the figure I'd photographed, even wading into the shallow water to examine the area more closely. Nothing. No depression in the mud where something might have stood, no unusual mounds of sediment, no remnants of military artifacts. The ground was soft and unmarked, covered by the same thin layer of algae and organic debris that characterized the rest of the marsh. Doubt crept in as I drove back to the station. Digital cameras could malfunction in ways that created false images. Moisture and temperature fluctuations might have affected the sensor. Perhaps fatigue and the disorienting effects of working in darkness had led me to misinterpret what I'd captured. But the print was waiting for me on the station's desk, and the mud soldier was undeniably there, rendered in perfect detail by the inkjet's microscopic droplets of color. I pinned the photograph to my bulletin board next to maps of the preserve and charts of local wildlife populations, where it seemed to watch me with its hollow sockets as I worked. 3 days later, I decided to print a second copy for my permanent research archive. The printer hummed and clicked, feeding the same digital file through its mechanisms with mechanical precision. When the photograph emerged, still warm and slightly damp with ink, I experienced a moment of vertigo that left me gripping the edge of the desk. The mud soldier had moved. The change was subtle but unmistakable. In the original print, the figure had been positioned between two cattail stands roughly in the center of the frame. In this new version, he appeared slightly closer to the camera, perhaps by 2 or 3 feet. The perspective shift was minimal, but definitely present. Details of his uniform were slightly larger, more defined. The raised arm seemed to reach more directly toward the lens. I compared the two prints side by side, measuring distances between reference points in the background. The movement was real, documented in permanent ink on photographic paper. Whatever I had captured that night in the marsh had somehow advanced between printings of the same digital file. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Printer calibration errors, Digital file corruption. Some form of software glitch that altered image positioning during processing. But I'd worked with digital photography for 15 years, and I knew the technology's limitations and quirks. This wasn't a technical malfunction. That evening, I avoided the marsh entirely, choosing instead to document bird populations in the preserve's upland areas. But the photographs on my bulletin board seemed to pull at my peripheral vision whenever I passed them, and I found myself checking the mud soldier's position obsessively, as if I might catch him in the act of movement. The prints appeared identical, until I wasn't looking directly at them. Sleep became elusive. I lay in the station's narrow bunk, listening to the building's nighttime sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the whisper of wind through the cypress trees outside. Sometimes I thought I heard other sounds, the soft squelch of footsteps in mud, the rustle of wet fabric, the distant echo of military drums. But when I rose to investigate, I found only darkness beyond the windows and the familiar chorus of nocturnal insects. On the 5th night after capturing the original photograph, curiosity overcame caution. I printed a 3rd copy, standing beside the printer as it worked, watching each line of the image emerge with methodical precision. The machine's mechanical sounds seemed unnaturally loud in the station's silence. The whisper of paper feeding through rollers, the precise movements of the print head, the soft hiss of ink meeting paper. When the print was complete, I didn't need to compare it with the others. The mud soldier had advanced again, now occupying the foreground of the image. His details were crisp and clear. The tarnished buttons of his coat, the water-stained leather of his boots, the organic matter that had accumulated in the folds of his uniform. His face, that terrible suggestion of features carved from marsh mud, was turned directly toward the camera now, and his raised arm extended beyond the frame's border, as if reaching toward the photographer, toward me. I backed away from the print, my heart hammering against my ribs. The photograph lay on the desk where the printer had deposited it, innocent and static. But I could feel a presence emanating from it, a weight of attention that made my skin crawl. The mud soldier was no longer simply documented in the image. He was looking out from it, aware of being observed. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations: stress-induced hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning from the station's aging generator, a psychological break triggered by isolation and overwork. But I couldn't deny what I was seeing, couldn't rationalize away the evidence pinned to my bulletin board. I gathered the 3 prints and spread them across the desk in chronological order. The progression was undeniable. In each successive printing, the mud soldier had moved closer to the camera's position, approaching the boundary between the photographed world and the physical one. If the pattern continued, I reached for the laptop, intending to delete the digital file entirely. But my hand froze over the keyboard as a new possibility occurred to me. What if destroying the digital image didn't stop the progression? What if the mud soldier had already crossed some invisible threshold, moving beyond the confines of the original photograph into something more permanent? The station's walls seemed to press closer, and the familiar sounds of the marsh took on a threatening quality. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, something was moving through water and mud, advancing with the patient persistence of geological time. I could feel its approach like a change in atmospheric pressure, a disturbance in the natural order that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. I printed a 4th copy. The photograph emerged blank except for cattails and moonlight. The mud soldier was gone, his position marked only by a slight depression in the muddy bank and a few scattered buttons that gleamed dully in the camera's flash. But the empty image was somehow more terrifying than his presence had been. It meant he was no longer confined to the frame, no longer bound by the limitations of captured light and digital memory. Behind me, water dripped steadily onto the station's floor, though the ceiling showed no signs of leaks. The sound was rhythmic, measured, like the footsteps of something that had walked a very long distance through very deep mud. I turned slowly, knowing what I would find, but hoping desperately that I was wrong. The mud soldier stood in the station's doorway, water pooling around his boots and streaming from the rotted fabric of his uniform. his hollow sockets fixed on me with the weight of centuries, and his raised arm completed its eternal salute. Up close, I could see that his face wasn't carved from mud at all. It was absence, a void in the shape of human features that drew light into itself without reflection. He spoke without words, his message arriving in my mind like sediment settling in still water. He had been waiting in the marsh for longer than the preserve had existed, longer than the roads and fences and drainage ditches that had carved the landscape into human patterns. Waiting for someone to notice him, to acknowledge his presence, to give him form through observation and documentation. Now he was documented. Now he was real. Now he was here. I understood then that the camera hadn't captured an image of the mud soldier. It had captured the mud soldier himself, drawing him from the depths of the marsh into the world of recorded light and printed ink. Each reproduction had strengthened his connection to reality, allowing him to advance not just within the frame but toward it, until the boundary between the photographed and the physical dissolved entirely. The prints on my bulletin board were empty now, showing only the marsh as it appeared to normal vision, but the mud soldier stood before me, ancient and patient and absolutely real, water from the Blackwater Preserve spreading across the station's floor in a slow, inexorable tide. I find myself wondering, in the days since his emergence, whether madness might be a more comfortable explanation than the truth. Whether the psychiatrists and colleagues who now speak to me in careful, measured tones might be right about stress and isolation and the fragile nature of human perception. But the station's floor still bears the stains where marsh water pooled that night. And sometimes, when I'm not looking directly at them, I catch glimpses of movement in the mirrors and windows around me, the reflection of a figure in a rotted military uniform, maintaining his eternal salute while water drips steadily from the brim of his tricorn hat. He's still here, waiting with the patience of geological time for the next photographer, the next moment of digital capture that might complete whatever ancient purpose drives him. And I've begun to suspect that he's not alone in the depths of the preserve, that the Blackwater Marsh holds other figures, other soldiers from other wars, all waiting for their moment of documentation and emergence. I've destroyed my camera and deleted every digital file, but I know it won't matter. Someone else will come to the marsh with modern equipment and academic curiosity. Someone else will point a lens into the darkness and capture more than they intended, and the mud soldiers will advance, one printed frame at a time, until the boundary between the documented and the real dissolves entirely, and the preserve reclaims everything the water has ever touched. Story 15. The ash still clung to my fingernails 3 days later. I'd scrubbed them raw under scalding water, but somehow traces of that gray residue persisted, wedged beneath the crescents like accusations I couldn't wash away. The books had burned easily enough. Too easily, perhaps. Pages that should have resisted the flame had curled and blackened with an eagerness that made my stomach turn. The leather bindings had released an odor I couldn't quite place, something between incense and decay, something that made the back of my throat itch long after the fire died. Martha's uncle had left me this house along with its secrets. 3 months of sorting through his belongings had revealed the usual detritus of a long life. Photograph albums with faces I didn't recognize, furniture that smelled of cigarettes and disappointment, and boxes of books that spoke of interests I'd never suspected. The occult collection hidden in the attic's farthest corner had been the final discovery. Volumes bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light, filled with symbols that hurt to look at directly. I'm not a superstitious man. I hold a degree in mechanical engineering from Northwestern, spent 15 years designing components for aircraft engines, believe in things I can measure and test. But those books felt wrong in ways that bypassed rational thought and settled directly into the primitive part of my brain that still remembered when humans huddled around fires to keep the darkness at bay. So I burned them. All 37 volumes, fed to the flames in the backyard fire pit over the course of an evening that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. The neighbors might have complained about the smoke, but the house sat on 2 acres surrounded by woods. And anyway, Most of the neighboring properties stood empty this time of year. The lampion had been sitting in the front hallway when I'd returned from that burning, exhausted and reeking of smoke. I'd noticed it before. An ornate brass thing with a glass chimney, the kind that belonged in a museum rather than a suburban home. But that night it seemed different somehow, more present, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it properly. Martha's uncle had been a collector, that much was clear. Every room held artifacts from different eras and cultures. African masks that seemed to track movement, Asian pottery that caught light in unusual ways, European paintings that depicted scenes I couldn't quite decipher. The lampion fit that eclectic pattern, though something about its placement struck me as deliberate rather than casual. I should mention the photographs I'd found tucked inside one of the burned books, pictures of the house's interior from decades past. In every image, the lampion appeared in different locations: the dining room table, the kitchen counter, the bedroom nightstand. Never the hallway. Martha's uncle had moved it frequently, it seemed, though I couldn't fathom why. The first ignition occurred exactly at 2:22 a.m. on the fourth night after the burning. I'd been lying in bed, somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, when warm light began filtering under the bedroom door. At first, I attributed it to a car passing on the distant road, headlights sweeping across the windows. But the light held steady, and when I checked my phone, the digital display read 2:22 with a precision that felt somehow meaningful. The lampion stood in the hallway exactly where I'd left it, but now its wick burned with a flame that cast dancing shadows across the walls. The shadows moved independently of the flame itself, forming shapes that suggested text, letters and symbols that seemed familiar, yet remained just beyond comprehension. They reminded me of the burned pages, though I told myself that was impossible. Paper turned to ash didn't resurrect itself as shadow writing. I extinguished the flame with a quick breath, the way you'd blow out birthday candles. The wick offered no resistance, dying with a soft sigh that seemed almost relieved. The hallway plunged back into darkness, leaving only the phosphorescent afterimage of those writhing shadows burned temporarily into my retinas. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of that night. I sat in the kitchen with coffee that grew cold while I waited for sunrise, trying to construct rational explanations. Gas leaks could cause hallucinations, but the house used electric heating and cooking. Carbon monoxide was another possibility, though the detectors remained silent. Stress from the move, grief over Martha's uncle's death, disrupted sleep patterns. Any number of factors could explain what I'd experienced. The second ignition came at 2:20 a.m. exactly. This time I was ready, having spent the day researching antique lamps and their maintenance requirements. I'd cleaned the lampion thoroughly, checked for gas leaks, even called a local antique dealer who confirmed that such pieces occasionally developed combustion issues due to residual fuel or wick deterioration. Perfectly normal, he'd assured me. Nothing to worry about. But normal didn't account for the 2-minute advancement in timing, and it certainly didn't explain the shadows. They were clearer this time, more defined. Letters in languages I didn't recognize formed words I couldn't read, but somehow understood at a level deeper than conscious thought. The shadows spoke of hunger and patience, of doors that shouldn't be opened and prices that would eventually come due. They moved across the walls like living things, reaching toward corners where darkness gathered more thickly than physics should allow. I photographed them with my phone, but the camera captured only ordinary shadows cast by an ordinary flame. The screen showed mundane patterns that bore no resemblance to the writhing script my eyes perceived. I took dozens of pictures from different angles, adjusting settings and exposure levels, but the results remained stubbornly normal. The flame extinguished as easily as before, leaving me alone with the growing certainty that I was either losing my mind or dealing with something that existed outside conventional understanding. Neither possibility brought comfort. 2:18 a.m. the third night. 2:16 a.m. the fourth. The pattern held with mechanical precision, the ignition advancing by exactly 2 minutes each evening. I began setting alarms, positioning myself in the hallway well before the appointed time, watching the lampion's cold wick with the intensity of a scientist observing a critical experiment. The ignition never varied. No gradual heating, No preliminary flickering. One moment darkness, the next a steady flame that seemed to emerge from nothing. The shadows appeared immediately, text that grew more complex with each passing night, symbols that made my head throb if I stared too long. They seemed to respond to my attention, becoming more animated when I focused on them, reaching toward me across the intervening space like fingers seeking contact. By the fifth night, I'd developed a routine. I would stand precisely 3 feet from the lampion, phone ready to record, notebook in hand to sketch whatever symbols I could manage before the flame died. The sketches never captured the shadow's true appearance. My hand would shake, or the symbols would shift just as I began to draw them, or the pencil would suddenly feel too heavy to control. Martha's uncle's journals, discovered in his bedroom closet, provided disturbing context. Entries dating back 20 years described the lampion's behavior in clinical detail. The exact timing of ignitions, the progression of shadow writing, the gradual advancement that he'd calculated would eventually reach midnight. He'd documented everything with the methodical precision of a man conducting a long-term experiment. His final entry, dated 3 weeks before his death, consisted of a single line repeated 27 times. It wants to be read. 2:14 a.m., 2:12 a.m., 2:10 a.m. The shadows had evolved from simple text to complex geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. They formed mandalas of impossible angles, spirals that seemed to descend into depths the wall shouldn't contain, networks of interconnected symbols that pulsed with their own rhythm. Looking at them too long induced a vertigo that had nothing to do with physical balance and everything to do with the growing sense that reality operated by rules I'd never fully understood. I'd stopped trying to photograph or sketch them. The act felt increasingly futile, like attempting to capture wind in a jar. Instead, I found myself simply watching, waiting, trying to understand what the shadows wanted from me. Because they did want something. That much had become clear. They reached toward me with increasing urgency, sometimes extending nearly to where I stood before snapping back to the wall's surface. The house itself seemed to respond to the nightly visitations. Doors that I'd left open would be closed in the morning. Objects would shift position by small degrees, not enough to be certain they'd moved, but sufficient to create a persistent unease. The temperature dropped noticeably in the hallway, though no drafts could account for the chill. Sleep became elusive, then impossible. I'd lie in bed listening to the house settle around me, every creak and sigh taking on potential significance. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat until I couldn't tell where I ended and the house began. 2:08 a.m., 2:06 a.m., 2:04 a.m. Martha's uncle's research had been more extensive than I'd initially realized. Hidden behind false backs in his filing cabinets, I'd discovered correspondence with university professors, translations of ancient texts, maps marking locations where similar phenomena had been reported. The lampion wasn't unique. Others existed, scattered across the world like pieces of some larger puzzle. His notes described them as temporal anchors, devices that somehow marked specific moments when the barriers between realities grew thin. The shadow writing wasn't random text but instructions, guidance for those who possessed the knowledge to decode them. Each lamp operated on its own schedule, its own countdown toward what he termed convergence. The burned books had apparently contained the translation keys necessary to understand the shadow's messages. By destroying them, I'd eliminated my ability to comprehend what the lampion was trying to communicate, but also, according to his notes, prevented something far worse from taking place. His final calculations suggested the advancing schedule would reach midnight within 6 months of his death. After that, the shadows would appear continuously, growing stronger until they achieved what he described as dimensional breakthrough. The phrase was underlined multiple times in increasingly shaky handwriting. 2:02 a.m., 2 a.m., 1:58 a.m. The shadows now covered the entire hallway, flowing across walls and ceiling in patterns that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. They'd begun to cast their own shadows, impossible secondary effects that created depth where none should exist. Looking at them induced physical symptoms, nausea, disorientation, the sensation that my thoughts were being observed by some vast intelligence that found them amusing. I'd considered destroying the lampion, but Martha's uncle's notes contained warnings about that approach. Previous attempts to damage similar artifacts had resulted in consequences that weren't detailed but were described as unacceptable. The language suggested he'd witnessed such attempts firsthand, though he provided no specifics about what had transpired. Instead, I'd begun preparations to leave. The house would be sold, the lampion donated to a museum or collector who might understand its significance better than I did. Let someone else deal with whatever was building toward manifestation in that hallway. I'd done my part by burning the books. Anything beyond that exceeded my responsibility. But the shadows had begun to follow me. Not physically, they remained confined to the lampion's immediate vicinity during the nightly ignitions. But throughout the day I'd catch glimpses of familiar symbols in peripheral vision, carved into tree bark visible through windows, formed by cloud patterns in the afternoon sky, reflected in the surface of my coffee when morning light struck it at particular angles. The symbols appeared everywhere once I began looking for them. Cracks in sidewalk concrete arranged themselves into meaningful patterns. Shadows cast by streetlights formed letters that spell words in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The world around me had become a vast manuscript written in the same script that danced across my hallway walls each night. 1:56 a.m., 1:54 a.m., 1:52 a.m. Reality had begun to feel increasingly negotiable. Time moved differently in the house. Minutes that felt like hours. Hours that passed in apparent seconds. I'd check my phone to find that entire afternoons had elapsed while I'd been reading Martha's uncle's research, though I remembered only sitting down to examine a single page. The shadows had developed texture now, rising from the wall's surface like bas-relief sculptures carved from darkness itself. They possessed weight and mass that defied their nature as mere absence of light. I could feel them pressing against the air in the hallway, creating currents and eddies that ruffled my hair and clothing. They'd also begun to react to my presence before the ignition occurred. In the minutes leading up to each nightly manifestation, the darkness in the hallway would thicken noticeably, taking on an anticipatory quality that made my skin crawl. The temperature would drop by degrees I could measure, and the silence would deepen until even my own breathing seemed intrusive. The lampion itself had changed. The brass had developed a patina that hadn't been there before. Not corrosion, but something that looked almost like writing etched into the metal surface by some unknown process. The glass chimney now reflected light in ways that created rainbow patterns resembling the shadow text, as if the artifact itself was slowly transforming into something designed to channel whatever was trying to manifest. 1:50 a.m., 1:48 a.m., 1:46 a.m. I'd stopped sleeping entirely. The house no longer felt safe during dark hours, though I couldn't articulate why. Every shadow seemed to hide potential movement. Every creak suggested footsteps that weren't quite footsteps. The familiar had become alien through subtle degrees that accumulated into profound unease. Martha's uncle's final journal, discovered behind a loose baseboard in his bedroom, contained entries that suggested he'd experienced similar phenomena. His handwriting deteriorated over the final months, becoming increasingly erratic until the last entries were barely legible. But his message was clear. The lampion wasn't trying to communicate. It was trying to emerge. Each night's ignition represented another step in some process that would culminate when the schedule reached midnight. The shadows weren't text to be read, but blueprints for reconstruction, instructions for rebuilding reality, according to specifications that originated elsewhere. The advancing time didn't mark a countdown, but rather progressed toward completion of some vast architectural project that used the physical world as raw material. He'd realized this too late to prevent the process, but early enough to hide the translation keys that would have accelerated it. The burned books had been his final safeguard. Without them, the shadows remained incomprehensible, their instructions useless to whatever intelligence sought to implement them. But incomprehensible didn't mean powerless. Even without understanding their content, prolonged exposure to the shadow writing was having cumulative effects. I found myself thinking in patterns that felt foreign, considering possibilities that had never occurred to me before. The world seemed less solid than it once had, more malleable to forces I was only beginning to perceive. 1:44 a.m., 1:42 a.m., 1:40 a.m. The shadows now moved independently of the flame, flowing across surfaces in purposeful streams that reminded me of circuit diagrams or city maps. They'd begun to extend beyond the hallway, creeping into adjacent rooms during the ignition periods before retreating when I extinguished the lampion. Each night they ventured further, claiming more territory in what felt like a gradual invasion. I'd documented everything compulsively, filling notebooks with observations and theories that probably sounded like the ravings of someone losing touch with reality. But I was still rational enough to recognize the possibility that this was exactly what was happening. Isolation, stress, grief, and sleep deprivation could easily produce the symptoms I was experiencing. Except for the photographs. While my phone couldn't capture the shadow writing directly, it had begun recording other anomalies. Empty rooms appeared in some images to contain furniture that wasn't physically present. Walls showed architectural features, doorways, windows, staircases, that didn't exist in the actual house. The lampion itself sometimes appeared in pictures taken when it was demonstrably extinguished, burning with that steady flame in digital images that contradicted visual reality. These photographic inconsistencies suggested either a malfunction in my phone's camera system or evidence that multiple versions of reality were somehow bleeding through into my perception. Neither explanation brought comfort. 1:38 a.m., 1:36 a.m., 1:34 a.m. The house had begun to feel larger than it actually was. Hallways seemed to extend further than they should. Rooms appeared to have different proportions than I remembered, and doors sometimes led to spaces that didn't match the building's architectural plans. I'd measured everything with a tape measure, finding dimensions that matched the original blueprints perfectly. Yet the spatial distortions persisted. The shadows had started appearing during daylight hours now, faint but visible in dark corners where direct sunlight couldn't reach. They moved with subtle purpose, arranging themselves into patterns that felt meaningful, even when I couldn't decipher their significance. The house was becoming a kind of living manuscript, its surfaces inscribed with text I couldn't read, but was apparently learning to understand at some subconscious level. Martha's uncle's correspondence revealed contacts with others who dealt with similar artifacts. Their letters described symptoms that matched my own experience: spatial distortions, temporal inconsistencies, the gradual sense that reality operated according to rules that had been quietly rewritten. Most of the correspondence ended abruptly, final letters expressing concern about individuals who'd simply stopped responding. One letter, postmarked 3 years earlier, contained a map marking locations where temporal anchors had been identified. The distribution pattern suggested a vast network spanning continents, with concentration points that formed geometric shapes reminiscent of the shadow writing. Whatever was happening in my hallway was apparently part of something much larger, a coordinated phenomenon involving dozens, perhaps hundreds, of similar artifacts worldwide. 1:32 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 1:28 a.m. Time itself had become unreliable. Clocks in different rooms displayed different times despite being synchronized days earlier. My phone's clock would sometimes jump forward or backward by minutes without explanation, creating temporal gaps I couldn't account for. The ignition schedule remained consistent within its own logic, but the rest of time seemed to flow according to principles I couldn't predict or understand. The shadows had developed auditory properties now, not sounds exactly, but something my brain interpreted as whispers just below the threshold of conscious perception. They carried meanings that bypassed language entirely, communicating concepts for which no words existed. I understood more with each passing night, though I couldn't have explained what I was learning to someone else. The lampion itself had become almost transparent during the day, its solid brass construction appearing increasingly ethereal. Light passed through it in ways that defied physics, creating reflections that showed different rooms, different versions of the house where familiar objects were arranged in unfamiliar configurations. These reflections moved independently of any actual changes to my environment, suggesting viewports into alternate versions of reality. I'd begun to see movement in those reflections, figures that weren't quite human, occupying spaces that weren't quite the same as mine. They seemed aware of my observations, sometimes turning toward the reflective surfaces as if looking back at me through the dimensional barrier that separated our realities. 1:26 a.m., 1:24 a.m., 1:22 a.m. The house had started breathing. Not metaphorically. I could feel actual air currents moving through rooms in rhythmic patterns that resembled respiration. Walls expanded and contracted by fractions of inches that shouldn't have been noticeable, but somehow were. The building had developed a heartbeat, a pulse that I could feel through the floorboards and in the vibrations that traveled through door frames when I leaned against them. The shadows had become three-dimensional now, extending outward from surfaces into the space around the lampion. They possessed weight and substance that my hands could feel even when my eyes couldn't see them clearly. During the nightly ignitions, the hallway filled with invisible architecture, structures I could navigate by touch alone, though they bore no resemblance to any building I'd ever experienced. Martha's uncle's final calculations had been more accurate than I'd initially understood. The advancing schedule wasn't arbitrary, but followed mathematical principles that governed the interaction between realities. Each 2-minute increment represented another degree of alignment between dimensions, another step toward a moment when the barriers would dissolve entirely. According to his projections, that moment would occur in exactly 17 days, when the ignition schedule reached midnight. After that, the shadows wouldn't need fire to manifest. They'd exist continuously, reshaping the physical world according to specifications that originated in whatever realm they represented. I should leave. Every rational instinct screamed that remaining here past that deadline would be catastrophic in ways I couldn't even imagine. But something stronger than reason had begun to take hold. A curiosity that felt almost like hunger. A need to witness whatever transformation was approaching. Because I was changing too. The nightly exposure to shadow writing had altered something fundamental in my perception. I could see connections between events that had seemed unrelated, understand patterns that spanned years of cause and effect, perceive structures underlying reality that had always been present but hidden from ordinary awareness. The world was far stranger than I'd ever suspected, far more fluid and responsive to consciousness than any scientific training had prepared me to accept. The lampion wasn't an artifact, but a key. The shadows weren't writing but architecture, and the approaching deadline wasn't an ending but a beginning. 1:20 a.m., 1:18 a.m., 1:16 a.m. 17 nights until midnight. 17 nights until I discovered whether I was documenting a supernatural phenomenon or simply chronicling my own descent into madness. Both possibilities seemed equally real now, equally possible outcomes of whatever process had begun when I'd burned those books and inadvertently activated something that had been waiting in the darkness for someone foolish enough to feed the flames. The shadows whispered promises I couldn't resist, and warnings I couldn't ignore. They spoke of doorways that led everywhere and nowhere, of realities where thoughts became substance, and will shaped matter according to desire rather than physics. They spoke of choices that had already been made and futures that had already been written in script, that danced across walls in the advancing hours before dawn. And in 17 nights, when the clock struck midnight and the flame burned without end, I would finally understand which version of reality was true.